Hello, my name is Jerome Richardson. I am with the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Memorial Foundation Share Your Story project. Today we are here at Bellevue University in Bellevue, Nebraska. Bellevue University is one of the main sponsors for the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Memorial Foundation's Vietnam Memorial Park. And part of the history and education features in that park are the oral histories, and we are working with the Library of Congress to capture the oral histories of our Vietnam veterans. I am here today with Johnny Friday, and Johnny has agreed to share his story. Today is the 5th of May, 2023.
Like JR said, my name is Johnny Friday, Johnny Dean Friday. I'm originally from Port Arthur, Texas. I first became aware of the Vietnam conflict at that time when I was not quite ready to go into junior high. I remember that I was in a government housing in Port Arthur, Texas, the Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred, and what it was that on television they had shown the North Vietnamese had paraded around our POWs that had been shot down. That was my first introduction to the Vietnam conflict. Not a lot was said at those times, and so I'm going to jump forward. My background is that I experienced extensive child abuse throughout my childhood from about 5 different abusers. I won't go into that in detail, but that's basically what my background was. So eventually, my mom moved me and my little brother to Houston, and after I graduated, she started harping on me because I had flunked my way through high school. They passed me through the grades. I was going to end up being drafted, and I was going to die in Vietnam in some rice paddy. I don't know why she said that, because there was nothing I could do about it, but she did make a good point. But I didn't have transportation to get to the recruiter to join the branch that I wanted. And I figured, well, better for me to choose a branch than to let the government choose a branch, because they were drafting guys like crazy. I mean, you turn 18, whether you were out of high school or not, you had to register for the draft. And they were calling guys every year. And it increased more and more each year. So in 1970, after I graduated in the summer of 1970, I told my mother when she came home from work that I'd already enlisted. It was a lie, but I told her. That was how I basically tricked her into taking me to see the recruiter, because I told her I had to go for my physical. So I went to the recruiter and I enlisted in the Air Force. I signed up for the Air Force. I figured if I didn't want to get killed in a rice paddy, why would I enlist in the Army or the Marines? And I didn't think that I would like the Navy. I just figured they'd put me in the bottom of the hold, and like all the movies, they would clam up, it'd spring a leak, and there I would be. And that was the last thing I wanted, was to drown. So I decided, go Air Force. So that's what I chose. I told the recruiter that I had to leave. So he told me that I could come back and I would I'd go through induction, go through the physical and everything with the guys, and then I would be able to leave. So when I got home with my mom, I told her, well, I passed my physical, now I need to go and leave. So I told her to take me back to the same place. That's when I went through my induction. If I didn't pass, I don't know what I would have done. But there were hundreds and hundreds of guys in line in our skivvies. The Navy was on one side of the wall, the Air Force and Army was on the other side of the wall. And we were standing there with a linoleum floor and our bare feet and our underwear, and going through line. And this Marine sergeant came busting into the hall. And I mean, he did not look happy. And we were just kind of melting, like, oh Lord, let it not be me. And he said, where are the Navy? And everybody on the left wall Army, Air Force, everybody immediately pointed to the other side of the wall. And those poor Navy dudes looked at him, and you could see their heart dropping. He went down the row going, you, and you, come with me. And the last guy, as he turned around, he did a pivot, and the others started following. The last guy in line said, but I enlisted in the Navy. And that guy turned around, I swear, he looked like he could have chewed nails and spit out tacks. And he said in his gritted teeth, you still are in the Navy. You're in the Marine part of the Navy. I went, oh Lord. So I'm glad that I went in the Air Force. But that, we never saw them again. So that was how the Marines got their guys when they didn't have enough enlistees. And so you go through the line and they cough and you go through and everything. So I was a 6'1", 147-pound wimp when I got in. And true to form, recruiter, no offense, doesn't tell the whole story. And I couldn't leave that very day, but I could leave the next day. So my recruiter did me a favor and gave me a voucher for a hotel downtown, little hole in the wall. And I was scared to death I was going to miss the bus, but I made it on time. And the Air Force actually sent me on my first airplane ride. It was a commercial flight from Hobby Airport, Houston, Texas, 200 miles to the west, to San Antonio, Texas, where Lackland Air Force Base was. That was the training center for basic training for all Air Force personnel in the United States. It was summer, it was August, and I went in and I entered a whole new world. It was interesting. Usually they put two, what they call TIs, not DIs like drill instructors. These were TIs, training instructors. And they usually have two to a squadron. And there are 50 guys in a flight, and we were in a flight, and we belong. There's so many flights to this little squadron. And we were in a 2-story building, and we were in the second floor, and the shots were pneumatic. One guy, because they're yelling at you all the time, they were telling us to move forward, but he moved when he shouldn't have, and he moved when they were trying to do that pneumatic injection into him with all these different vaccines, and it sliced his arm, so he ended up having to go to the hospital to get that stitched up. There was a whole sort of variety of guys in those times, because they were pulling from all parts of society. They called us rainbows because we had different lengths of hair and we had different colored clothes. We were the new guys. That didn't last more than a day, because the first thing they do is shave your head and give you your shots and then issue your clothes, which are about 2 sizes too big, except for the boots, they fit. We started going through training, we started going through physical training. It became evident real quick that I wasn't physically up to par. And on one occasion, we were out at the PC field, which is a physical conditioning field. And there are a few hundred of us out there at one time with TIs roaming around as we're doing our push-ups and our jumping jacks and our sit-ups and everything, being conditioned and brought up to strength for what we're going to need to do in the service. There was a guy next to me when we were doing push-ups that stopped, and his face was away from me and he wasn't moving. And I kept doing my push-ups as they told us to go up, go down, and they would naturally tell you to hesitate and so forth. But he wasn't moving, and I was concerned that he was going to bring wrath and hellfire down on us. But I knew enough not to get involved. You're scared to have the DI jump down your throat, so you're scared of getting their attention. Eventually he did get a DI's attention, and the DI, or TI, came and stood at his head screaming at him. I'm still doing my push-ups. And he bent down, and another TI comes up. And the next thing I know, they're telling us to start running the laps around the conditioning field, which was usually the last thing we did. I never saw that young man again, but I don't think he survived. Then as we were running, I might have made it around the track. Well, it wasn't really a track, it was just the perimeter of the field. And I may have made it around one time when I saw another guy several hundred yards ahead of me that was bent over, and a TI was screaming at him, and I figured he was fixing to vomit, but he didn't. He collapsed. About the time he fell at that TI's feet, a red flag went up. Well, that was the signal to the base that it had gotten so hot that summer, because you're out in the desert. San Antonio is pretty much out in the desert. Not like you vision, but it's very dry and very hot. And of course we're going, well, about time, but I don't think that guy survived either. When we got back to the dorm and they took us into the day room of our dorm, each dorm had, on a different level, was locked. You had an automatic lock to the door so that nobody could get in. So we had dorm duty, which was pulling basically guard duty at our dorm, so that no one got in except the people that were supposed to. Inside there is our own day room. So they took us in the day room and they told us that if we were ever feeling queasy or lightheaded or anything like that, to let them know and not to do the exercises, to stop. And so I think that was why that those two young men didn't make it, or else they ended up in the hospital. I hope they made it, but I have no way of knowing one way or the other. At that same time though, the IG team showed up on base because guys at that time felt that here's the lightest duty branch of the service that you can possibly get into. If you get washed out of that service, then surely you are unfit for military service in any other branch of service. So that's what some guys were trying to do. And they had various ways that they were trying to do that, because the Vietnam was going on and nobody wanted to get killed. There were two young men, from what I gather, I don't know this for a fact, but the rumor was, and this was a place of rumors, that they had been egging and ragging on their TI. And he grabbed them by the collars and he bashed their heads together and killed them. They went into comas and later died. And we think that's why the IG team showed up. The IG is Inspector General team. It's not a good thing to happen when an IG team shows up. They're there to find out what the heck happened so that it wouldn't happen again. So we don't hear about that, but we also start hearing from the TI certain things that tend to indicate to us that we're to let them know if we're being we feel as though we're being, ragged on too hard. So there's a change in the environment as far as the atmosphere. The other stuff was like going to day camp. It was like going to the Boy Scout camp or the Girl Scout camp or summer camp at the YMCA. It was fun, There were funny things that happened from time to time. We didn't call it I forget what they call it in the Army, but we call it a confidence course, to build your confidence up. And they have these little pyramids of 50-gallon drums and ropes you go up and down and everything else. Well, there was one thing that everybody talked about, and it was the minefield. They called it the minefield. Well, I came running around that bend, and there was nobody around as far as I could see, except this guard tower at the other end and these barbed wire mesh, kind of concertina wire type tunnels, the little mounds, and you were to crawl through them. So, and they're only about as wide as you can get your arms on the ground. So I'm scuffling through, and I'll be darned if they're in somebody in that tunnel and he's taking up the whole tunnel. He is big and he isn't moving. He's just there. And so I grabbed one of his boots and shoved on it. Well, this hand comes over my left shoulder and grabs the other boot. So evidently, one other person from the other flight, because I was the last guy in my flight, but they caught up with me. I was that slow. And he pushed the other leg and I turned sideways and we seesawed that guy through the tunnel. And when we got to the other side, I took him by the belt on his butt and rolled him to the right so that I could get out. And I hauled butt. Not one single mine went off during that whole time. I figured that what it was the TI up in that tower was laughing his ass off so hard that he didn't remember to throw any switches, because not too long after I turned around the bend, then you could hear the explosions going off. He came to his senses, but I lucked out on that. Then I come around another bend and there's this opening and there's these guys that are lined up, guys like myself, Airman Basics, and there are these beams and they have ropes on them, and there's this little mud puddle type thing that they're doing Tarzan across, and you're waiting your turn. And one of the things that my TI told us, it didn't make sense until I came around the bend, because they didn't tell us what to expect. But he always said, well, wait for a good rope. If it's swinging, wobbly, don't go for it. I'm going, oh, okay. Well, now I understood what he meant. And when it came my turn, lo and behold, the guy in front of me pushed off. Now, I guess he figured he was doing me a favor, but it started wobbling back and forth. So I was going to wait and have them re-swing it to me, but about, I guess it was a third of the way across that pond, something in my ear screamed, "Chop!" And I did, and that rope was nowhere near me. And I belly flopped into that muddy water and came out of there. I was soaked like a drowned rat. And I pulled myself up out of that mud puddle. It was only about, I guess the water itself was maybe 2 feet deep, 2.5, and the mud, the side walls of the pit, maybe another 3 feet. So it wasn't nothing to pull yourself out of. And when I started getting to some of the other trials, they had me go around it because they didn't want me to get them wet, cables and bars that you're supposed to go across for other guys, because it would become a hazard for them to fall. So they had me go around it. My TI was not happy to see me, and I was the only guy soaking wet in my outfit in my flight. But that was kind of the stuff that went on. We only went through it twice. The second time I knew better, so I did better, and was able to get on the other obstacles, going across this little river type thing and so forth, and made my way through. I had to, because I was in such bad physical conditioning, I had to go through remedial physical conditioning, which meant after I went through everything during the day, the drills, the marches, the learning how to salute, and all this other stuff, and the classes on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UMCMJ or whatever. But we had to learn that. In fact, the moment they give us the book, which is the first day, you're responsible for knowing it. You haven't read it, and already you can be prosecuted for breaking any laws that are in it. So you're motivated to start reading it and trying to learn what you're supposed to do. But you're so busy with these other things. I thought on one Sunday that I would get out of going to church when they asked us what denomination. I said, well, I had no denomination, thinking I'd be able to lounge around the barracks. No, I ended up with a toothbrush and a toothpaste and scrubbing with a toothbrush and toothpaste scuff marks off our linoleum floor in the barracks. That's how I spent my Sundays from then on. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, I went through remedial physical training. So after the end of the day, when everything's done and guys are polishing their shoes or reading their books, that we're supposed to learn and everything, me and a few other guys were in the day room being put through physical training, the sit-ups, the push-ups, the jumping jacks and everything like that. They'd push the furniture aside and we would work out even more, trying to build ourselves up. So I was about 6'1" and 185 pounds when I got to the other end of basic training. Basic training at that time for the Air Force was 6 weeks. So I put on 40 pounds of muscle in 6 weeks. I didn't get to go home immediately. After basic training, we get our first stripe after that, and we're called airmen. Airman basic has no stripes. We got our first stripe on graduating. We became airmen. I had to go to my tech school. Some guys got to go home before their tech school because their tech schools were almost a year long. Some of these guys were becoming, they would get involved in intelligence, cryptology, and stuff like that, interpreters, all sorts of stuff. And their training was a lot longer. And I didn't know that at the time. I would learn that later as my career went forward. At that time, all you know is they get to go home and you don't. So I got on a bus that took me to the panhandle of Texas, in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is a plateau type area. So it's cold as the wind comes across there. So by the time I get there, it's well into autumn, and I'm there through winter. So we end up wearing parkers there. I was a turboprop aircraft maintenance specialist is what I was being taught to become. Initially, when you graduate, you're an apprentice aircraft maintenance mechanic.
Was that at Shepherd Air Force Base?
Yeah, I was at Shepherd Air Force Base. It's interesting, the whole world changes there. initially on that first time, I think it was just to help us know where we were supposed to go for classes. They marched us, and a flight has like 50 guys in it, and there were maybe 150 guys there. That first day we were there, we were pulled in the day room of the barracks where we were, and we could hear the guys outside, and it looked like they were imitating like they were playing ping pong. And you would hear a guy go ping, and the other guy go ping, and the guy that was giving us orientation said, "You know what that is?" And we were kind of like, "No." And he says, "Well, that's the supersonic sound of the growth of hair, because we had none, and they did. They had been there long enough for their hair to grow out." So that's kind of what that was. Remember that early morning, that first day of marching, we marched past the WAF's barracks. That's the Women's Air Force. They weren't integrated into the regular men's Air Force. We were segregated from them in that regard. In basic training, you learn to dig that heel in, and you come down as a flight, you sound like thunder. And that window went up, shoom, this little head sticks out, says, "Shut up!" And 150 men started tiptoeing. No joke. All it took was one woman, and 150 men were put in their place. But that was kind of the way things were then. We were very, male chauvinist pigs at that time, as they referred to men at that time. So anyway, made it to the hangar where we learned how to perform maintenance. There was an actual C-130A model there, which is one of the earliest models. I'm not sure you could even move that aircraft with a tow vehicle anymore. It had been there for so long. But we learned how to do our skills. We were shown films. I learned about machinery that the public didn't even know about. Gunships. But you really don't know that that's what you're learning at the time, because you don't know enough about the Air Force to know that that's what it is. I'd heard about an SR-71. I heard about it flying up so high that they needed a spacesuit the pilot needed a spacesuit, that it flew faster than a bullet, so that they couldn't use bullets. They couldn't use a machine gun on it. What was called a Vulcan cannon Gatling gun is electronic machine gun. They couldn't use it because if they slowed down, it would shoot them down. They would shoot themselves down. So they were anticipating using rockets on it. Well, why would you create something like that? Because intelligence had said that the Russians were working on one, and the Soviets were still going on at that time. There was still a Soviet Union. We were still in a big Cold War with them at the time. So that's what it was all about. And we learned about that and all these other things. We learned about aeronautics, what made an aircraft fly, the principles of aeronautics, and we learned about what our aircraft were made of, the frame, the magnesium that makes up the frame, the different things that can stress on it. You name it, we learned it, so that we could deal with it. We were what became known as the crew chief. The crew chief didn't come up from a regular maintenance group. We were specially trained. If a specialist could not do it, say you went into, because C-130s go all over the world, they were an aircraft that had the capabilities, a jet engine with a reduction gear so that the axle on the jet engine doesn't sever from the torque that's put on the props. So they have planetary gears that reduce the spin on the propeller from the jet engine's axle, but they're able to vary the pitch on the prop. It's movable. And so they're able to take off in the length of a football field. Yep, 300 feet, they can take off on a football field. They can land on a football field because they put the pitch of the prop into reverse and they push all that thrust in a 180,000 pound aircraft, empty, can land on that football field and stop. It's also, at that time, was one of the only aircraft that could actually back up on its own power, fully loaded. It had that capability. That's what we were learning. If an electrician wasn't available in the little dump that we went into, yours truly had to be able to replace it. They might fly in the part using a Cessna or something else, an OV-10 or whatever, to get it to us. It may come down a jungle trail. You just don't know how it's going to get to you. The crew chief, if he's on board, he's the one that's got to replace it. If there's a hydraulic problem, you have to be able to fix it. Any system on that aircraft that needs to be fixed, if there's not a specialist to do it, yours truly has to do it now. And I'm 18 years old. I turned 19 when I was in basic training, but I didn't let my TI know that. I knew better. So I just turned 19, graduated from tech school sometime in late December, early January, and I was given orders to go to Hawaii. In basic training, they gave us a choice. We could choose where we wanted to go. And I don't know why, I got a burr up my butt when I got in there. I'd seen some parajumpers, they were PJs, and they were the sweetest looking things I'd ever seen. I wanted to be a PJ. And so I tried and I flunked out. I couldn't pass the water survival test of it. I darn near drowned. But I respected them. And so when I learned that I was going to go to Hawaii where there was a PJ rescue outfit, I was tickled pink. But when I was in basic training, I had volunteered first for Vietnam. I don't know what made me change my mind. I guess I thought that Air Force in Vietnam was going to be different than Army in Vietnam. It wasn't, but I thought it was. That's how much I knew about it. And my second choice, I figured, well, if I don't put down Hawaii and I get Vietnam and my mother finds out, she will kill me. So I was more afraid of my mother finding out that I had volunteered for Vietnam than I was of being in Vietnam. So your attitude changes once you get in the service. That's part of what happens. You become, I don't know how to put it. There's a whole different society. There's a whole different way of doing things in the military. It's a whole different lifestyle. And you begin to evolve and adapt to that lifestyle. When I got into tech school, I started drinking for the first time. I started drinking heavily, beer. When I got to Hawaii into the rescue outfit, I started drinking hard liquor. It tasted sweeter and I became a lot wilder. But it was a 4-year tour. I made $147 a month, kind of like my weight when I went into basic training. In Hawaii in 1971, that ain't gonna work. I was the only airman. Everybody in the squadron was either a buck sergeant or above. So what was initially happening was I would be sent on a task and some sergeant would intercept me and tell me to go to do something else. And I was getting run all over the place and nothing was getting done. So they assigned me to one particular staff sergeant, Thomas Gordon, and he was 6'3" and weighed 245 pounds, I think it was. Huge, massive dude, but fun, really cool. And he taught me a lot of old JT training. Of all the things that we did, I was more afraid of liquid oxygen than anything else, and not because it would freeze on you, because you wore a heavy apron and heavy gloves, asbestos gloves, and a face mask. So it wasn't that. It was what would happen if it got in contact with a petroleum-based product. And there were petroleum-based products all over that aircraft, grease all over the place, which naturally gets on the ground. So there's this stainless steel catch pan that we put, because there are no gauges to tell you when it's full. You keep filling this reservoir about this big, that's green, that's in the wheel well, until on the side of the aircraft is a vent. When that starts spurting a solid stream of liquid oxygen, then you stop. And that scared the living daylights out of me, because while I'm doing this, my trainer, Thomas Gordon, is telling me, you don't want to stomp on this stuff. And it's like, well, I kind of didn't want to do that to begin with, but why? He said, well, when you're working on the aircraft and around these other places, it's very likely you're going to get some grease on the bottom of your shoe. And if you stomp on that, that grease will mix with that liquid oxygen and it will explode. And some guys, from what I hear, and of course you don't know this for a fact, these could be stories that they tell you to make you not do it. And it certainly made me not do it. There were these guys that were stomping on it, or this one guy that was stomping on it, and little pops, because there's little beads. But he stomped on one that was a little oversized and it blew part of his foot off. And so you learn, well, we're not going to do that. But what you do learn is that being around aircraft is extraordinarily dangerous. And you don't want to daydream while you're working on it, and you don't want to go against what the tech manuals tell you. They're there for a reason. Every single C-130 had on it its own library, massive multi-volume, each volume about this big, on different subjects on that aircraft, so that if it went into an area where I was on the plane, it could tell me step by step how to change whatever I needed to change. And you had to use those manuals, because if you didn't use those manuals and you did something and it went bad on you, then you bought the farm. Well, we call it buying the aircraft. Maintenance crew chiefs had the perception or the attitude that we were told that if a plane went down, it was because of, say a plane had 9 people on board, a whole crew of 9 people. There were eight murders and 1 suicide. The 8 murders were the other people on the plane. The suicide was the pilot who drove it into the ground. But if it was a mechanical problem, then there were 9 murders and I was the one who did it. And you didn't want that on your conscience. So all through my service, I was very conscientious. Later, I will be diagnosed as an adult in later years with obsessive compulsive disorder. And I tell you, in the service, that came in handy, as you'll begin to see later. But there was this one chief master. We called him the Little Indian because he would go on warpath every now and then. We also called him Napoleon because he was about the same stature, and he was basically what we referred to in the Air Force as a pencil neck, by the book manager, because that's really all a master sergeant is in the Air Force, is a manager. It's the guy who's tech sergeant and below who actually does the work. Tech sergeant is the line supervisor, staff sergeant is usually the supervisor of the aircraft, and then you have us ground pounders that are actually working on the aircraft, doing the little jobs. And so I was an apprentice on the job training, soon became a specialist. I went from having a 3-level skill level to a 5. It goes 3, it's odd, it goes from 3, 5 to 9 to 7 to 9, and 9 is a manager's level. 7 level is your tech sergeant's level. 5 level is a sergeant and above. But you have to have the 5 level before you can get promoted to sergeant. So I earned my 5 level real quick and was promoted to airman first class. But orders came down looking for airmen to go to the Philippines. They were short-handed, and that was because of what was going on in Vietnam. And you're going to find that a lot went on outside the borders of Vietnam than what you realize. So I immediately, to get out of this whole 4-year tour with $147 a month, where I couldn't do anything, it was literally at the other guy's discretion as to whether they wanted to buy me beers off base. Otherwise, I was going to have to stay on base. I couldn't afford to go off. So I volunteered for a 2-year tour in the Philippines that was prorated because Hawaii is considered an overseas tour. So the 9 months that I spent in Hawaii were counted towards that 2-year tour in the Philippines. But they sent me home before I went to go on leave. So this was my only second leave, really, of getting to go home. The first time was after I graduated tech school, before I went to Hawaii, and that was during the winter. This was a little in the summer. So when I went home, my mom lived in an apartment complex by this time, and so it had a pool, had a swimming pool. And I made the mistake of going down there. In fact, I made some big mistakes. First one was wearing my uniform in Houston. The second one was going down to that pool, because there were a lot of young people my age down that pool. A lot of young men and young women. And they had long hair. I didn't. I had military cut. And you could tell by my demeanor by that time, the way I carried myself. I didn't slouch. It just, your whole way of being is changed, and you can tell. And I was in the pool, when I found myself in a corner surrounded by these young people, screaming and hollering at me, calling me a baby killer, wanting to know how I could do such a horrible thing. They never asked me anything. Never asked me if I'd been to Vietnam. Never asked me if I was in the Army. Never asked me if I'd killed anybody. I was condemned by my haircut. I was condemned by my goddamn haircut. And so I made my way out of the pool with the screaming and hollering crowd behind me, and they stayed within the bounds of the pool that was fenced in, and I went home and never went back to that pool again. From that point on, I kept volunteering to go back over. I never wanted to be back in the United States again. My own people didn't like me. I'd find out later guys went on leave, they wore wigs. That's how they made it, so that people wouldn't know that they had haircuts. One guy told me he did it because he didn't think a girl would go out with him on a date if she thought he was military. You learn a lot of things. So I went on to the Philippines, and the guys had told me, because I didn't receive an orientation before I went, and I should have, because I darn near got myself killed over there. It was very violent over there. It was like going into the Wild West of the United States. The guy told me, you don't call a Filipino using this. You don't go, hey, come here, guy. Because that's how they call dogs. And a dog is the lowest thing in their culture. It's the scum of the earth, in their opinion. So if I do this to them, I just called them the scum of the earth, and they will kill you for it. Well, I felt weird doing that. They said, go like this. And that was bizarre to me. So I compromised. I went like this when I was in the day room at my job for the first time, because I wanted a cold drink. And this guy, he was a Filipino that was the bartender, the hooch bar. We didn't serve liquor there. It was Cokes and things. And guys would lounge around there before they had to go out on their shift out on the flight line. And everybody would get there early. Nobody ever wanted to be late for work. And sometimes after you got off of work, you were so tired that all you wanted to do was kind of decompress. So you'd go in there and just lounge around. So his job was to provide soft drinks to us. We didn't pay for them. But other guys were calling for Cokes and stuff like that. So I called and I went like this. And that man wasn't smiling. And he walked up to me and he bent down in my ear and he whispered to me in the most cold-blooded sentence, if you ever do that to me, I'll kill you. And I had no reason to doubt him. Well, I made it to my barracks. I made it out on the flight line. I started applying my skills and continued with OJT training, on-the-job training of what I was doing. Our aircraft were camouflaged. The ones in Hawaii weren't. When I was in Hawaii, I learned how to put on the skyhook system, which is the whiskers that you see in John Wayne's movie Green Beret. We actually did use that. And so I learned how to put that on and how to take it off. And when I got to the Philippines, that wasn't how it was done. They had a helicopter unit of Jolly Greens that were there, HH-53s, that we in-flight refueled. They had this boom, and we were a P model. The other was an H model in Hawaii with the whiskers. We were a P model that had the capability of internal fuselage tanks. Each tank carried about 1,500 gallons of jet fuel. And then there was the 75,000 pounds of fuel for the C-130 itself. So this thing, 180,000 pounds empty, so now you know what it pretty much weighs when it's full. And so it sits low. And so it has on each wing these hoses that are reeled up, and they're released on a winch type thing out, and they have a little donut parachute on spines. So it's not cables, it's on spines so that, it doesn't droop or anything. And the wind catches that and holds this huge, rubber-like, and within the rubber is this steel mesh of protecting the hose and everything. So that goes out over 100 feet, and the helicopter comes up, skewers that thing. Yeah, it takes talent to do that. I'd never be able to do it. And then that's how they in-flight refuel. Sometimes after they're done, they won't retract, and so they have a guillotine built into this device. It's huge, and it has a casing over it to make it streamlined, and they cut it. So sometimes we end up having to change that thing, and fortunately there's a specialist there that on this base will do it. Clark Air Base is where I was at, and it was the largest Air Force base in the world, especially overseas. Let's put it this way, they had riding stables. They had their own elementary school the same size as any elementary school that you find in a city. So it was a huge place, but it also had a lot of stuff there. Radar sites that you didn't go out to, that were massive. They looked like, even from a distance, that they were the size of a football field. They were huge. Our part was on the other side of the base where the C-130s were, and so the first chance I get, I go off base. And I go off base and I take a jeepney. It's like a little Jeep, World War II Jeeps that were left behind that the Filipinos took and decorated up, and now they use kind of like taxis. And they tell you that, you know, there's this little triangle in the window, go with them because they're licensed and registered. If you get with a driver that's a gypsy, he will tell you one price. He will take you out in the boondocks, pull out a .45, and you will pay him whatever he asks, or you will die. And that was no stretch of the imagination. But I went downtown, and I got off this bar row, and it was Angeles City. Angeles City is referred to, even over there, as Sin City because of the prostitution that goes on over there. And so you have a lot of girls hanging out the windows going, oi, 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 and calling you over, you know, and calling you GI and everything else. They say that if they've seen you 3 times, they know you for life. And I don't doubt that either, because they knew me by sight real quick. And but I was walking, and this car pulls up. I don't think anything of it till the door opens up, and this guy gets out with a .45 tucked in his belt and a Thompson submachine gun. And he's civilian. And then you find out that's what everybody around there is carrying, but not me. We're among our allies, so we're unarmed. We're not allowed to carry weapons. Fact is, the Philippine government, you're subjected to their laws. If you break one of their laws, they can throw you in prison. And the way their law is at that time, or was at that time, I don't know what it's like now, they needed no proof, they needed no evidence. All they needed was a charge. They could charge you, claim that you did something, and they would arrest you, put you in prison, and then work out the details. That's the way it was. So you didn't want that to happen. If they arrested you, they did what was called international hold, because you had a military passport. And it was through Manila, our U.S. Embassy in Manila. And they pull that passport, and you don't get it back, and you can't get out of the country without it, even though you're flying on a military aircraft, a U.S. military aircraft. Well, I'm adapting to the situation over there. I love the dog, eating them. Those people know how to cook dog. I don't know what else to tell you. They don't have cattle, people. What do you think? There aren't any Herefords over there. There's no Angus. There's water buffalo, and they aren't going to eat them because those are their tractors. You don't see mechanized agriculture over there. You see a water buffalo, and that sucker is huge. They make our Angus and our Brahma. If you blended those two together, they would still be wimpy compared to these things. But they look docile. I don't know what they are. I never went up to one to find out. But the farmers knew how to make them behave. You didn't want to drive over there because you could be going along the highway or down the road in the city. It could be a 2-lane road, and all of a sudden all the traffic's coming your way. There were no stop signs. There were no traffic lights. There were no cops calling directions. They would just turn around and come at you on a whim. I had one guy in our outfit, I went and visited him in the hospital because he made the mistake. He liked riding motorcycles. So he bought this little moped type. It's bigger than a moped, that's an understatement. So it was a regular motorcycle, but not a Harley Davidson or anything like that. And he got run off the road by a bus, and it peeled him like an onion. And I went to visit him in the hospital. He looked like a mummy. And it did a number on him. No traffic laws. But guess who was at fault? Him. Yeah, not the bus driver, him. The other visiting alien to their country is the person who's responsible. And the weirdest thing is that the whole time I was over there, it would be a few tours before my mentality changed. But in all honesty, I looked at those people as being the foreigners. I'm in their country, and I'm thinking of them and looking at them as though they're the foreigners. And that was ridiculous. But I was going on. I was still developing a drinking habit. A guy talked me into going with him downtown so that he could go to his martial arts class. Next thing I know, I'm taking martial arts. But I loved it. I started getting heavily involved in martial arts. So when I wasn't on the flight line working my duties, I was in the martial arts dojo learning Gujaru karate, which was Okinawan type karate. And I was getting heavily involved in it. And, you know, I saw some Chinese movies, but it was really interesting. They really do have strangers come into your dojo and challenge you to fight. And what it is sometimes your instructor has invited them in and you don't know it. And so he wants to test you if you're getting up in skill. He wants to find out what you can really do. And my instructor did. He kind of took me under his wing because I didn't know any fighting. Because of the breakup in my family when I was young, nobody taught me how to fight. So I was a clean slate. I had no bad habits. And it just awed him to have that putty to be able to mold. And but there was an occasion when another instructor came in from some other dojo in a different style with a guy who wore no belt, so we didn't know what he did. And pretty much he was an instructor who was fishing for students. And that's what they do. They come in to kind of show that his guy's better than your instructor's guys, come over to his dojo and learn real martial arts. So that mentality is going on in my head. At the same time, I'm going down a road of degradation in this culture that I've been dropped into without any orientation. I'm becoming more cynical. Guys are getting put on the international hold left and right. The people in that country want out of the country. President Marcos. I remember watching a TV show in the barracks, and it was Filipino TV. And at first I thought it was a comedy, kind of a spoof on our Meet the Press. But it was legitimately him. It was their president on Meet the Press of their version. And this lady had called in because his army had come through and taken all their rice. Rice was their agriculture. There was fishing and there was rice. The Philippines is not just one island, it's an island chain of, I think close to 1,000 different size islands. And Luzon, it was the largest one, and we were in the center of it, in a little valley that belonged to a volcano, Pinatubo. But it was inactive at the time. It wouldn't stay that way, they found out. But anyway, he listened to her talk about how his army came in, and he started asking her her name. Wanted to know her name, wanted to know the village, and said he would send somebody to help her out. And I knew in my heart of hearts, yes, he was going to send somebody, but they were never going to hear from her again. He had done that. She had done this on public TV in his country and put him on the spot. While I was there, he passed a law in the middle of the night that it was against the law for young men to have long hair. And the way I found out was I had stayed off base in a little bungalow, and when I came out early in the morning, it was kind of misty and foggy, and I was walking down the streets, and it's kind of a semi-dirt street, semi-asphalt street, and it's weird. Something was out of place. Something wasn't right. I've been there for quite a while now, and at least 6 months. And then I realized there was this pile on the side of the road every few, maybe 25 yards. It was human hair. his army had come through the night and pulled their young men out of their homes and shaved their heads. Well, and maybe cut them short, not actually shave them like our basic training, but he cut their hair short. He made it against the law. However, he made a stipulation, an exemption. You could get a license, they could get a license to have long hair if they were a band member that played in a U.S. band or where U.S. servicemen played, frequented, because U.S. servicemen love their band members to have long hair. The reason that he had the hair cut, they had these young men cut, was because they were having civil disobedience and issues in their country. It wasn't a fun place to be. There were assassinations going on and all sorts of stuff. And but there were riots, from what I hear, and demonstrations going on back in the States. And he equated the young people, demonstrators, having long hair with dissidents. So the best way to get rid of the dissidents, cut the hair. And that's what he did. Of course, it didn't apply to Americans, but then again, our hair wasn't that long to begin with. But we were allowed to grow our hair long. We weren't told, we just did it. Because the things got kind of lax in April of 1972. The North Vietnamese had a front, an assault, three fronts on South Vietnam. It was later referred to as the Easter Offensive. It was without warning. It was during the rainy season. Americans didn't think we weren't prepared for it because and nobody's going to fight you in the wet, surely. Nobody's going to have a mechanized assault in the monsoon season, but the North Vietnamese were afraid of our Air Corps. Our Air Force, our planes, and what we could do with those planes scared them to death. So they chose the stormy season on purpose, thinking that it would ground our aircraft. And I'm sure it did some aircraft, but hey, C-130s are all-weather aircraft. B-52s fly above it. And so for the next 6 months, there was all-out war like you wouldn't believe. And planes were getting shot down left and right. They had a new weapon. It was called Strela. At first, we didn't know what it was. Eventually, people were being brought back and to recovered, and they found out it was a shoulder-launched, heat-seeking missile that would go up to 15, 20,000 feet in a matter of seconds. I mean, you're talking maybe you've got 20, 25, 30 seconds at the most before that thing's up at your level. It's small, it's lightweight, it's disposable, canister, they shoot it off and they go. So some of these guys were getting hit with this thing. It was going up their tailpipes, and they were shooting down aircraft a lot. So what they did was they mobilized us to 24 hours. We were 12-hour shifts, no days off for however long this was going to take. As it turned out, it was about 6 months. And initially we were scrambled in, we were called in. We broke our butts to get armor plating into flight deck. Now, I don't know, what's that going to do? Well, it might stop small stuff, but if it hits a wing on a C-130, it's going to blow it out of the sky. But you don't ask, you don't even think about it. You just put on this heavy, I guess 50-pound plates of armor plating, and you screw, they have these little panels on there, and you screw it into the side of it and fix it in place. So we did that for the flight deck around it. We did it on the seats for the engineer, who was kind of up and back and between the co-pilot and pilot, and the navigator was off to the side for him, and then the PJ was in the back, the parajumper, rescue parajumper. I gotten to know the PJs. I liked them a lot. One particular one took me under his wing, and I learned about him particularly because I went on my first alert duty, which means that you sleep in this little trailer on the flight line, and it's the alert shack, more or less. You sleep there for your own call, no matter where you go. You're given a radio. You don't even go take a dump without that radio, because you have to scramble on a moment's notice in case someone needs that rescue team. So this is before this offensive happened. So I met him. He took me under his wing. he showed me how you go into a place, you let them know what you're on call, you're with the rescue outfit, they get you to a particular table. Even if you go to the theater, yes, we had two movie theaters, full-blown movie theaters. You let them know where you're at, they put you in a particular seat, that's where you see the movie, so that if they need to get to you, they can. And you still have that radio, so you back up, they call, you get there, you have your own truck and everything. So I got real close to him. But then when this offensive happened, we lost all of our helicopters. They sent them to Vietnam because rescue helicopters were being shot down like crazy. They weren't the only thing that was being shot down. Our crews started pulling in flights into the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, right about in here, where pilots were getting shot down by like crazy, because this is where they were coming in, here, along in here, I imagine down in here too, because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was going through Laos and Cambodia, and then into South Vietnam, into different areas. So they were coming in, and our guys, from what I gathered from my crews, were flying in the DMZ area right in here to try and recover pilots that were being shot down. Only one crew chief got to go with them. But when the wing found out that a crew chief had gone into combat zone with these guys, and there was really no need for him to be there, because there's so many other outposts where C-130s are in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, and if they went into Thailand, there were even more places where C-130s could go in. So they were flying across the South China Sea into South Vietnam and into the demilitarized zone between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, in order to in-flight refuel the helicopters that we sent over there to replace the helicopters that had got shot down, along with the helicopters, these Jolly Greens that were already there. So we're doing that, and so we're pulling 12-hour shifts. So I would go there kind of like in the afternoon before the sun set, and I'd be there until sunrise, and I'd work all the way through the night. My plane that I was on, I was a sergeant by that time, had my 5 level. So now I had the power to ground an aircraft if I felt that it was not airworthy. And so there were 3 flights in the morning. There was a 3 o'clock flight, I believe. The last flight was about 6 o'clock. So somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning were these 3 flights that went out. Well, my trainer, Bagna, my trainer in the Philippines, had taught me, if you want a plane to take off, you give your air crew some of the nicer amenities to go with them. We had hot plates on board, you made sure they worked. We had large canisters of cool water, you made sure that those were filled. You made sure that the major things on the aircraft that could bring it down were taken care of and were working. You made sure that the flight deck was well illuminated. Any burnout light, you change it. You make it as easy on their eyes and as easy on their day as possible, because they were going to go through hell the rest of the day. I remember one flight came in from Cam Ranh Bay. Cameron's down around here. It was their squadron, their C-130s here, their rescue C-130s here, that would fly into Clark Air Base, and we would do annual maintenance on them, the heavy maintenance on them. They got their light maintenance there, but when it came time to scrutinize the aircraft for cracks in the frame and stuff like that, because the gyrations that the plane had to go through in order to avoid getting hit by the enemy, they put a lot of stress, and so you could get cracks. So they actually x-rayed the aircraft. They would have these huge x-ray machines that go from the tail all the way to the front, all over that thing. Well, they had top priority. We didn't. If they ordered a part, it was going to be changed within a day. I mean, they had flights coming in from the States, from Guam. They would get that part to them ASAP, as soon as possible, to get them back into Vietnam and back on job. Well, we knew that. So what we would do is we would have our plane towed into the same vicinity of where their plane was parked before it went into the hangar. And we would have a shopping list of everything major on our aircraft that was broke. Because if we didn't do what I'm fixing to talk about, we wouldn't fly. Our crews weren't flying into Vietnam. Our crews were at the time, before this offensive, mainly what we got scrambled were, for lack of a better term, Chinese junks. They were boats that were leaking in the China Sea. They were fishermen. And so they were Filipino fishermen, they were fishermen from other countries that made it into deep sea for their fishing industry. And they would spring a leak and we would have to scramble to go rescue these guys. And that's mainly what we were doing at the time. And so my crew chief, Bugna, had given me a list of things he wanted me to get. And he went up into the flight deck to talk to the crew chief. Yeah, it only came with one crew chief. He didn't come with his crew, his ground crew. We had the ground crew. So while Bugna, Staff Sergeant Bugna, was talking to and distracting the crew chief up in the flight deck, I was in the cargo bay stripping it clean of whatever we needed. But I didn't strip it clean and leave it because I knew from another guy's mistake. You don't do that. You don't leave a vacuum, because then the OSI comes wanting to know, where did it go? The OSI is the Office of Investigation, okay? Office of Special Investigation, I believe is the way it goes, OSI. Well, I had a sergeant one time that made the mistake of leaving nothing behind, and they showed up and we made sure it got back real fast. But what I went and did was I took the broken part with me. So you only go with one part at a time. And so you're kind of whistling and strolling along, not catching any attention, and you got whatever you have either in your hands or in your pockets or whatever, whether it's small or big. And you go with the small stuff first. You kind of go over there, you kind of get in. Then you start replacing things. The broken thing for the good thing. And then you kind of make your way back to your aircraft. And then you start getting bigger and bigger items. And the last item was this water jug. It was a big, huge water jug. It was messed up. It wasn't working right. So I kind of lugged it over to the, of course it's empty, but lugged it over to his aircraft, swapped it out. Of course, I'd swapped the hot plate out before that. That was a plug-in. And so I came back. So to let my crew chief Bugna know that I was done, I went up into the flight deck. And I'll be darned, Bugna was sitting there, or I should say standing there, leaning on the plotters. It's a device that the navigator uses that has an eyepiece in it, and it calculates ground speed and other stuff for the aircraft. And the navigator uses it. Well, the crew chief was down on the floor working on something, and so his eyes were diverted, and Bugna was sitting there ever so gently unscrewing it and put it in his pocket, pulled out the bad one, and turned and twisted on it because the other one was cracked. So he switched it, and that's what he was doing. And then when he saw me, he knew that it was time to go, and he said his goodbyes and congratulations and have a good time to the crew chief that was Vietnam veteran or in the making, and now was taking a leave with his aircraft in the Philippines, which wasn't much of a leave. And that's kind of how things went on this. Well, I had learned from him, so I made sure that my aircraft were up to snuff, but it got a reputation. And my crews, it seemed, I didn't realize this, I wasn't hanging around. I'd go work on whatever I was told to do next after mine took off. But after I launched my aircraft, which was always the first aircraft to leave, that 2:30, 3 o'clock takeoff time, excuse me, they decided, this guy, this Sergeant Friday, he's so good at this, we're going to take him over to the next plane and see what happens when the next crew shows up. Because the crews aren't attached to a plane, they're rotated. So all the crews eventually made it on my plane. So eventually I know all the crews and all the crews know me. So when they see me on that plane, they go, wow, this is Sergeant Friday's plane. Cool. Well, what I would do, because I still believed, they go down, I'm the murderer. And I'm not going to let that happen. So I always made sure I pull up a stand. There was a B1 and B5 stands that were available around the aircraft. And I'd go up and look, I'd take a flashlight, I'd look up inside pull the props to a point where I could look inside the intake on that jet engine part, look at that to make sure there were no cracked turbine blades as best I could. Then I would go down into the wheel well. And what I'm looking for are cracks in the track and leaks and anything that will cause that landing gear to collapse. And it's a dual landing gear, so there's a front and a back tire. They're huge tires. So you go up in there and you look up in the track, and then you go around and you look up in the other one, everything's fine and dandy. Go around the back to the other side, you can look up in the one, look up in the other, then you go around the nose, you look up in the other, and then you get inside and you go looking at the hydraulics of the flight controls to make sure there are no hydraulic leaks in there that they're going to blow. In Hawaii we had one that did. It took all the crew, everybody on board, to pull the stick back because there was no hydraulics to help with that flight control. And those flight controls, if you've ever driven a car without power steering, you have an inkling of what it's like to have an aircraft that size without any hydraulics to help with flight controls. It will crash, and it was on approach when it happened. It hit so hard when it landed that it knocked the anti-collision lights on, which is about 2 G's to make them come on, because they're crash lights, and they don't come on normally unless there's been a crash, so that people know how to get out of the aircraft. They can see enough to make it out of the aircraft. That's how hard it hit without crashing. That's the C-130. So I was doing that routine, checking all these systems to make sure they didn't have something like that. Then they found out, well, you know, he did good on the second one, he did good on that first one, let's drop him off at the third one. So I did that. So my daily routine during this whole offensive was to go from the first craft that was mine to the second to the third and launch them. And all this is going on. We're not only doing that, but lo and behold, Brigadier General Charles Lindbergh, yes, the Charles Lindbergh, who flew from the United States to Paris in the first nonstop flight, he was still around. Blew my mind. I thought the man would have been dead and gone long before. Well, he was up there on an expedition that had taken a helicopter in, and they were looking for some sort of lost tribe or something, some tribe that had been detected up there that had never had contact with a Caucasian modern man, as it were. They still used very primitive tools and everything else. So evidently him and his expeditionary group went in there. Well, their helicopter broke down up in there, and they were on this little ridge. Well, we got scrambled for that. That's happening the same time that this offensive with the North Vietnamese Army is going on. So we're doing two things at once. I went on that one with Charles Lindbergh in rescuing that one. I was on the C-130 that in-flight refueled that helicopter, and I got some pictures of it, of the helicopter, the H-53, that did the taking off of, because that's some maneuvering to load, because they're not landing, they're hovering there and they're getting off this ridge. And I'm not even sure that it was on Luzon. It may have been on some other island. There, I have a picture of a Navy frigate that was involved, that was below us. It was an interesting, I was real happy to get to go on that flight, because I was never going to get to go into the Vietnam flight. But anyway, as things progressed, that was my routine. Jet engines, landing gear, flight control, hydraulic systems. Well, it was the last aircraft of this day, and I went up into it, I looked at the turbines, and I went around to the left side, looking toward the front, went into the forward wheel well of the main landing gear, went to the rear well, went around to the other side, went up into the rear, and came out, went around to the front of it, looked up, and then I came out and I froze. Something wasn't right. Something had caught my attention. And so I went back up in there and I crawled up as high as I could so that I could feel, because I couldn't believe my eyes. This plane had already been approved for flight. It had already been signed off. It was ready to go. And the crew was on its way. And I was just supposed to stand there and let these people and shake their hands and see them off with a 12-inch crack up the track of that main landing gear. I came out and I was excited. My heart was just pounding. I knew I'd found a biggie. This is something that an aircraft crew chief looks for. You want to do the big thing that saves your crew, and this was it. You want to mean something. If all my career was for nothing else, this alone made it worthwhile to have been in the Air Force because of what it meant for that crew. I came around, I went up in, it had 3 airmen on it. Not airman first class, airmen, 1 stripers, 3 levels. I went up in there and I knew there was just a gut feeling. But in my heart, I didn't want to start writing and have someone tell me to stop. I didn't want to tell someone what was going on, so I kept my mouth shut. And contrary to procedure, the first thing I did was I wrote a red X into that flight log, that maintenance log, which immediately grounded the aircraft. A red X is a big deal in the Air Force. I may be able to put one in, but I don't have the rank to sign it off. It's going to take somebody a lot higher than me to sign off that red X and say that that aircraft is now airworthy to take off. So I had done a big thing as far as everybody was concerned on a mission that was absolutely necessary with no other aircraft available in our squadron. All the others were being worked on. These were the 3 that we gambled on. These were the 3 that we put all our effort in for the night. These were the only 3 that we had to give them that day. The other 2 made it. I started writing the description of what I found in very detail so that nobody would misunderstand and miss finding it. The engineer came up because the airman that was over my shoulder watching, he freaked out and went running out the door. And I could hear him screaming to the truck that is on the radio, the maintenance truck that goes by, who's kind of oversees, the tech sergeant that oversees our flight line for us. And so all heck is breaking loose just as the air crew shows up. And the engineer is going to be the first one. He's going to be doing his roundabout, his inspection, and then the rest of the crew will show up. So he comes up and he's looking over my shoulder and he's reading what I'm writing. And he reads enough to realize what's going on. So he goes out, he comes back just a few minutes later, and he comes back, yep, this plane isn't going anywhere. And so when I finally walk out the crew door, the forward crew hatch, there's so much glitter on the shoulders out there and so many stripes that are far beyond my little 3 stripes that I turned and went the other direction and went back to the barracks. Eventually my tour would end months later. And as the aircraft that took me back home to the States was taking off, and I was going down the runway to take off, and I looked out the window and I looked at the hangar, that aircraft was still on jacks in that air hangar because the United States Air Force did not have the means to fix the problem. They were still waiting several months later for the manufacturer to show up with his crew to fix the problem. They had gotten a waiver to tow it from that spot to the hangar where they left it. So that was kind of the Philippines as far as maintenance went. As far as downtown went, it was wild. Guys were being put on international hold. There was one point where we stopped going downtown in order to coerce the people to stop putting the young men on hold. What would happen is they would put a young man on hold saying that they raped her. And the reason was so that if he didn't marry her to get her out of the Philippines, then he would at least pay a ransom as it was. He would pay something to her that would enable her to buy her way out of the Philippines. And I don't blame them because they were treated like dirt. Prostitution, it wasn't a voluntary thing, I don't think, for them. They had barracks of women over the bars. And I never paid for sex overseas, and part of the problem I think was that I had light hair. That was unusual. I wasn't a jerk. I tried to be nice to them, and they wanted to get out of that barracks. But I made one mistake. When I showed up in the Philippines, believe it or not, 20 years old, and I never had sex. And I decided one day I'm going to have sex. So I went downtown, went into a bar, This young lady was flirting with me all through the night. She put a lot of effort into me to get me to take her out. She didn't have to, but she did. But there was an issue that was made it impossible for her to go out that night. And so I turned my attention to another bar girl, one of her friends. Went out with her, achieved what my mission was that night. But when we came back and the jeepney driver pulled up to the back of their bar where we were going to drop my companion for the night off, there was screaming and hollering and cussing in a language that I didn't even know. It was Tagalog. That was the native language of that area. And they're not, they have several different ethnicities in the Philippines. Tagalog is one of the languages. And it turned out the young lady with me got very somber, very serious. That young lady had put a contract on me to have me killed. And it's weird, they want you to suffer mentally before they kill you physically. So they let you know that there's a contract on you, so you'll sweat it, and then they'll kill you. One guy got killed in the turnstile coming on a base. He was stabbed 3 times in the back and was dead before he hit the ground. Still had a smile on his face. This was serious business, and I didn't know what to do. The young lady turned to me, the one next to me, and asked me for $5, a US $5 bill, and I handed it to her. And she went over to a jeepney driver, and she put a contract on this girl to have her killed if anything happened to me. She'd be dead before nightfall. And that's how I got out of the Philippines, how I survived the rest of my tour. I knew better to do than what I did, and things got a lot more serious for me. I really needed an orientation before I went to the Philippines, and I didn't get one. I learned it the hard way. Even if a person is pulled from one tour to another, somebody needs to give them an orientation. Let them know what the situation is, because it isn't like back home. You're not in Kansas anymore, people. I made it back to the States. I was stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. It is the largest stateside Air Force base. It's approximately 500 square miles. It was the test ground for armament and weaponry for the Air Force. That's where they try all the new Gatling guns and bombs and everything else. I was working on there and went to several different missions. Went on one to Veracruz, Mexico, looking for a gentleman who had a friend or relative in Pentagon. He was lost. We never did find him. He was there to recover an aircraft, a civilian aircraft, to bring back. It was a World War II trainer that he and his club had bought, and they were wanting him to bring it back, but he got lost and crashed into a blind. There were identical canyons, and one was a blind and one opened up, and he went down the wrong one. And a peasant would find him 3 years later, from what I gathered later. And we do kind of find out things in the Air Force. And they finally found his body. Some peasant did. Some local farmer found the crash and his body in there. I'm sure skeletal remains by then. But anyway, got back from that. Went to, I became what was known as the TDY crew chief, temporary duty assignment, because I was at first the only single guy in the outfit. All the other guys were married and didn't want to go anywhere. And I don't blame them. But I loved flying and I loved traveling. So I was volunteering for every mission that I could find. I went to all these trash dump, little podunk type missions. I went to Puerto Rico and didn't get to enjoy being in Puerto Rico. We were flying a flight that was escorting, this is true, weird. There was a small aircraft, wasn't military, kind of like a beach nut aircraft, one of those type, twin engine, and it was carrying mosquitoes, sterile mosquitoes or something with them that was supposed to do some experiment or something in Puerto Rico with their mosquito population. We were flying escort for them. So here's the C-130 flying in orbits around on its way to Puerto Rico. We land, we have a problem. The crew gets to go where they want to go. I worked overnight. I finally found out that I didn't have the part that I needed. I kind of jerry-rigged. On the jet engine, there's this panel that opens and closes. It moderates the amount of airflow that goes into the jet engine. as far as cooling the jet engine, not for its intake for running the jet engine, but for cooling it. And it wasn't operating, so I basically wired it open, and we were able to get home because they couldn't get the part to us. Like I said, stateside you have low priority compared to what's going on in Vietnam, and it's still going on at that time. So I got back. Well, they came up with Skylab, and it was going to be the first nighttime launch of a spacecraft. Well, I wanted to go. And they said, well, you can't go, you go on all these other things. We're going to go. So they, they were arguing amongst each other. I'm going, no, I'm going. Otherwise, that will be the last mission that I ever volunteer for, and then y'all can start going for them. Well, I got to go. And I went to Patrick Air Force Base down near Cocoa Beach. And at that time, it was called Cape Kennedy. It had been renamed after President Kennedy. Later, it will be renamed back to what it was before, which was Cape Canaveral. But I got to watch the space launch, and I got some photographs, not of that because it was dark, but of the aircraft, and I picked up some patches and got to go back. And then there was another mission waiting for me where Brigadier General Lawrence Gordon, not related to my first trainer, he had taken over the wing, gotten promoted, and he was going to go on this tour of all the squadrons that were underneath his wing, which went all the way, extended all the way to California. And so I got to go. And I really liked General Gordon. It was interesting, our first meeting together in debriefing, I showed up and I was a buck sergeant, 3-striper. They call it something else now. It's not even considered a sergeant now. But anyway, he said, there are 3 bunks on this aircraft. They were for helping, if you picked up survivors or something, you could put these people in there. But at the same time, when they weren't used for that, the crew would use it if they were on long hauls, because C-130 can fly for a long time. So he said, well, that forward bunk is mine. The other one belongs to this crew chief because he's going to be working all night long if this plane breaks to make sure that I get off the ground. And the rest of you can fight over that last bunk. And so that was kind of neat. And the other thing was, the people on this crew are going to eat whatever I eat. He was an enlisted man's general, and it was cool. So I had spiffed up that aircraft. I had taken Windex to the windshield. I had cleaned that sucker off. There wasn't anything. It was just clean as a whistle for that general. I already liked him. Well, the crew came on board. The general was flying. There was another, I think he was a captain that was with him. He was in the co-pilot seat. Well, somewhere along the line, as they were taxiing out to the runway, it got hit by a bug. One bug. Well, when we landed to the next base, that captain came out and met me in kind of an area of the cargo bay before it goes up into the flight deck. He didn't really ream me, but he made his disapproval well known in my face. And but what he didn't know was, after he was coming down behind him was the general, and he just kept on going, didn't really stop. I didn't think anything of it. I mean, I don't work with that captain. I do my job, I do what I do. He didn't like the fact that that bug hit it. There's nothing I can do about it. You just go on and clean the plane, fix it. I worked on that plane that night. There were issues that needed to be dealt with, and I spent the night working on most of it. One of the other ground crew members that we were visiting, they didn't have C-130s there, and it was real interesting to have these people look at this huge thing in their little bitty planes. They're able to push, and I need a tow truck to move mine. So their base assigned a maintenance person to me. That was kind of neat. I felt really like a prima donna, getting escorted around to all the places and showing all the sights in the wee hours of the night, and then making it back in time to grab a couple hours sleep and then head out to the plane before the general does and get it warmed up and everything nice and handy, which doesn't mean warm up, doesn't mean turn on the engines. It means getting the aircraft ready and getting the auxiliary power unit going, and that turns on the cooling, the heating system, everything else, because it was cold and it was winter. And so the general comes up. We're headed towards California, and it's warmer there. But it was so interesting. I didn't think anything of it. I really didn't notice the general walking out, you know. But when we landed, we had a headwind, and that aircraft landed maybe 2 minutes late, and that general made his discontent with that 2 minute late with that co-pilot. And I knew in my heart of hearts, that general really wasn't worried about that 2 minutes. That general had heard that captain jump my garbage over that bug that I had no control over, just like that captain had no control over the headwind that they were flying into. And I think he made his point. That General Gordon was an enlisted man's general, and I liked him a lot. And later, when I got back from that, though, there were orders waiting for me. And this was a secret mission, a top secret mission. Even I didn't know where I was going. What I was told was to take my 50-pound toolbox, and you did. You had a huge aircraft toolbox with all sorts of types and sizes of tools in it. And then you had the little tool bag that you use daily, and you take out whatever you need for that day and do your work. But obviously I was going someplace important if they wanted me to take that 50-pound toolbox with me. They told me to dress for any kind of weather, so I wouldn't even know where I was going. I had to take my mobility bag. You keep a mobility bag that has a change of clothes in it, a changed uniform, utility uniform, work uniform, in that 50-pound toolbox. And they put me on a C-130, one of their C-130s, and I didn't know where we were going. Only the crew knew where we were going. And I was the only passenger on it. When I got off, I was in Washington State, and I was on a military base, and two MPs, SPs for us, security police, met the plane. The plane didn't stop running. It let me off, and they escorted me as the plane turned around and went back to where it came from. And I went to a hangar. There were guards at the hangar with M16s. The men that met me were armed. There were no detour, went straight to that hangar door. The big hangar doors were closed. There was just this one little entry door. I walked through that door. They had taken my toolbox from me, and they had taken my mobility bag from me, and I walked through that door, and there were hundreds of men inside that hangar, and more were yet to arrive, and more kept coming and streaming in from all over the United States. All of us aircraft mechanics, most of us C-130 mechanics. And somewhere early in the night, the wee hours of the night, we stepped out, and there was a charter Northwest 747 waiting for us, civilian. And they loaded us up, and still didn't know where we were going. Just knew it must have been a big deal for all of us to be there, and nobody asked what we were going to do or where we were going. We knew better. It took off. The next time it lands, it's all night time, which doesn't make sense to me because it wasn't that long of a flight. The only thing I can figure is it was headed north, where it would have been nighttime, and because of the polar situation. And so we land, and it's all dark. They let us off in a commercial terminal, and there ain't anybody there. It's not a military terminal, it's a civilian airport, but there ain't a soul in it. And so we wander around, several hundred of us that filled up that 747. And then the first thing I'm asking is, oh, please, Lord, not here. And so they tell us to get back on, which is, whew, thank you. And then the next flight was a lot longer. And that's what it was we were going nonstop to another destination. And we were headed east. And so we land in what is obviously Japan from the windows. We're not anywhere near the airport. It is a civilian airport, but we're kept at a distance. And they refuel it. But you can see from the signs and the people that are, you look out the window, you look out the window and you can see you're in Japan. And I had been on one trip to Japan, TDY from the Philippines on one occasion. But it was like, oh, please let me here, and they won't let you off, so you know, well, this isn't it, and that means we're in the wrong part of the country, of the world that we don't want to be in, but we know basically what's going on. And then it takes off again, and this time it lands in another island. It's not Vietnam, but it's not a U.S. territory. It's a different country. And we get off, and they search our bags and our toolboxes. It takes over an hour with dogs, drug dogs, looking for drugs. They keep us up in a hotel. We took up the whole hotel, and we have civilian clothes on now. We were allowed to go out about the town, but the next morning were put in caravan. The rumor was that the plane that was before us crashed, and that's why we were bussed across. I had no way of knowing that, and no officer ever told me that. It was just the way rumors go. All I do know is that we were put on coach buses, and it was nice, comfortable. It was like being on a tour bus. And they started busing us across in this convoy of buses, of coach buses, across this island nation. And we get to the other side up into an area where there's a base, a military base. It's a military Air Force base, but it's not a U.S. military Air Force base. The first thing I was told was, you don't talk to their guards, because that will get them shot. If they fall asleep on the duty, they will be executed on the spot. Their country is under martial law. Evidently has been for years. So you know not to mess with them. And I'm working on a different type of C-130. It's not a rescue type C-130, so it's not one that I'm used to. And on a rescue C-130, when that sucker is on the ground, it has switches that detach and cut off systems that will allow the fuel to be disposed of while you're in flight. And so we use those pumps to drain the tubes, the tubing, the pipes that we refuel with. You know, and you use them to help eliminate the standpipe that the fuel goes up in, because that's 60 gallons of jet fuel stuck up in there. So you're trying to get that out of there. You don't want that up in there. You want to use it. So I messed up. I didn't use it. I had the tech manual, but I thought I knew the procedure, and I didn't. And I hit that switch, and fuel comes swooshing out the end of the wing, and a fuel dump and I hit that sucker as fast as I could. Everything shut down, and everybody, I called for the fire department. There's been a fuel spill. Our fire department shows up, and we're working, and everything's cooled down, and we're getting the plane ready for takeoff. And here comes this other fire truck, and they never stop, but they come around, and it's the fire truck for the country that this base belongs to. It's their Air Force's fire truck. A half hour later, comes flying around with lights and sirens and everything else going, does a loop around us, and then goes back off where they come from. And I thought that was hilarious. Then I show up for work one night, I was working the night shifts, and their crew chief for that aircraft didn't show up. And I was a sergeant. I was the highest rank on the flight line for that aircraft that day, and I was told to get on board. So with my mobility bag, with my 50-pound toolbox, I got on that plane. And I took my toolbox and I shoved it underneath the flight deck, which you can do, and I chained it there. And then that was secure, I thought. I'm sitting down on these troop seats, and there's these pallets full of who knows what, because they're covered with a tarp. This is in 1973. And there's a mesh over it to hold the tarp down, so you don't really know what's on it. And they have what's called dual railing. It's 2 rail tracks with little rollers in it, so that the pallets will move smoothly on and off. That's how you push them off and get them off. Because they're so heavy. Now I'm looking out the window, and we're lowering in altitude, and we're coming in for a landing. And I see the jungle, I see the kill zone, I see the Constantino iron that we're flying over at a low altitude, and they're in a light one on, except the little blue lights, they're letting the pilot know where the runway is. And then as we're coming in, just before we touch down, I see the silhouette, this darkened guard tower. I don't see anyone in it. It looks like there may be sandbags or something. It's really darkened, and it's very eerie. Going into a combat zone in that situation is the eeriest feeling I've ever had. I'd never been in that kind of situation before. And we taxied. I mean, he hit reverse prop on that, and I mean, we just lunged sideways as he was stopping as fast as he could, pulled off at the first stop that he could to get off that runway, made it to where he was supposed to park and shut down. And I followed the engineer. That's who I usually work with. They're the first crew member that shows up. And so I'm following him around like a little puppy. And I see the loadmaster lowering the ramp and raising the door so that the pallets can get out. So he's preparing to unload. And the engineer, they wear this vest, and it's in case you get shot down. And in the vest is this holstered 38. It's a military 38, has 6 rounds in it. You're a non-combatant when you go down, so you're not going to engage with an AK-47 against an AK-47 with a 6 shooter. But he took that revolver out when that forklift driver started coming toward us. And it was a little old man of that native country, and as far as I could tell, he was the only one there. And it started slowing down because he pointed that revolver straight at that man's face. And the man stopped, and out of nowhere, these other little ladies come out, and it was like looking at a movie that I'd seen. And they started heading toward the loadmaster. And I watched this engineer climb up on that forklift and put his arm around that man's shoulder, and he put that barrel up behind that man's ear. And I heard him tell that man, "You hit this aircraft, I'll blow your head off." And I stood there and I watched that, and I was just, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's the eeriest. It was so surreal. It was so much out of the Twilight Zone that we used to watch as kids. And he sat there with that man, holding on to that man with that revolver up against that man's ear the whole time he unloaded those pallets. And I'm sitting there watching, and I'm noticing that there are only 3 people in, and there was a whole plane full of people there, air crew, the people that were in the seats on either side of those pallets, and none of them are around. And I noticed, well, there's a spotlight, and it's shining on the back of that aircraft so that they can unload. And I'm in that spotlight, just like the loadmaster and just like the engineer. But the engineer has to be there, and the loadmaster has to be there. And I start looking around, and out in the dark, and I mean, there isn't a light one anywhere else, and off in the shadows, in the dark, I can see little figures huddled. And I knew what was going on. This idiot was the target for some sniper out there. And I figured it was like being on that minefield. That sniper must have been laughing his head off. He couldn't believe his eyes. But I kind of meandered my way into the shadows of the fuselage of that aircraft and made my way along the fuselage and out the wingtip and into the huddled group and watched the rest of the scene play out. And then the loadmaster came and got me. And then me and that loadmaster went through that aircraft looking for hand grenades. What the practice was, it seemed, was that some of those base personnel that were native to that country would take a hand grenade and wedge it in between those rollers. And then they'd pull the pin before they left. They'd put it someplace that wasn't noticeable. And when the plane flies, when an aircraft plane flies, any of you that have flown on an airplane, you know it shakes. There's turbulence. There's just a wind going over the aircraft makes it tremble. Vibration. Well, it vibrates and those rollers are moving and they pop out and that hand grenade comes out, the handle comes off of it and it blows up and down goes the aircraft. So that loadmaster and I are looking for that. We're going through the dual railing. We're going through any place else that they might have stuck a hand grenade, a live hand grenade with the pin pulled so that we don't blow up in midair. And welcome to that country. And then we got back on the aircraft once that was cleared, and that little crew, that native crew, went about their business, and we got on and we took off as fast as we could. About 15 minutes into the flight, heading in toward Thailand, I guess, pilot comes over the radio and tells us that the base that we just left is under mortar attack. There was somebody out there watching. He just had bigger fish to fry than my little head, my melon, and they were after whatever it was that we had dropped off on that base in 1973. And landed in Utapao Royal Thai Air Force Base. There are no U.S. Air Force bases over there. That's not our country. We leased them. We leased the rights through whatever treaty and everything deal that our country's made with them to be there for however long they'll let us be. And so there were B-52s there, and there were KC-135s. KC-135 is the loudest aircraft I've ever heard. It's a water-injected afterburner type system from what I gather, and that's so that it can take off. This sucker is huge. It's like a passenger aircraft filled with jet fuel, because it's going to in-flight refuel those B-52s, because it takes so much fuel for that B-52 with its 8 little bitty engines to take off with its bomb load, that it has to be refueled immediately after it takes off. So the buffs, the B-52s take off, and then these KC-135s take off, and they in-flight refuel out there. And it's a neat thing to watch a B-52 take off. They're thin like a pencil, and they've got wings that are like an albatross. They're just beautiful, and it flaps. Yeah, it flaps. A B-52's wings, once those little things retract that are holding the wingtips up, will actually go up 15 feet and down 15 more feet from center. It flaps about 30 feet in flight. It's like a daggum bird. But it was interesting to watch. It was interesting to watch. I didn't go with the aircraft. My assistant wanted to go, and I figured I'd had enough excitement in the Philippines to last me a lifetime. So he went wherever that aircraft was going, doing whatever that aircraft was doing, for whatever reason it was doing it during 1973. After about a week or so, I was sent back. The neatest thing about that base was there were no dogs wandering around, no stray dogs. And I found out why, because as I was walking back to my barracks where I was holed up while I was there, past this little pond, and there was this log in the middle of the pond, well, kind of off center, and there was this boa constrictor up inside that, out on that thing, on that log, and there was still much of him still in the water. I figured that's where the dogs went. But anyway, I got back to the other country, stayed there for a bit, and then about one day before 90 days, because what I was told, and there was one guy who was trying for it, that if they hit 90 days, they had to give you a short tour. And they didn't, and if you have a short tour, you become visible. Well, see, while I was there was this meeting that I happened to walk in on. It wasn't a secret meeting, so that was no big deal. But they were looking for volunteers to go someplace that nobody wanted to go, to pick up people that really need to be picked up. And I was hot and bothered to go. But they wouldn't let me go because they said if anything happened, I would become visible. And I didn't exist. Up to this point, I did not exist. For all intents and all purposes, everybody in the United States, family, friends, and everybody, thought I was still in Florida. And I didn't get to go where I wanted to go. Wish I had. I would have loved to have met who they were picking up. Would have loved to have been a part of that. I can understand the men who didn't want to go. They were family men. They didn't want to become part of that scenario if something went bad. But I didn't think anything would go bad. I didn't think that the people who were holding him would be that silly. Why the heck would you do that? The first thing you want, what they wanted most for us, was to leave, and we were doing that. So why not? So I didn't think anything was going to go bad, but then again, I don't know everything. But they sent me back to the States at 89 days, so I didn't become visible over in that area. Haven't talked about it for many years. But when I landed, I got back to the States, got back to Eglin Air Force Base, I had more orders waiting for me. When I was in Hawaii, and I was with my trainer, there was this blackbird. It was not the kind that was tagged blackbird, it was a black C-130, pure jet black. And it was off in the distance. It wasn't with the rest of us. And it was surrounded by guards, by military police with M16s, and nobody could get near it. And I was curious, and I asked my trainer, what is that aircraft? And he says, that is a gunship. That is an AC-130 gunship. I went, wow, that is cool. And he said, and you can be part of the crew. And I said, say what? He says, yes, there's a crew position on that aircraft that's filled with aircraft maintenance crew chiefs. And so I volunteered, and I kept volunteering. And after about 3 years of volunteering, I came back from this mission from no man's land to have orders waiting for me that trained me into air crew, combat air crew for AC-130 gunships as an illuminator operator. As I would find out, there weren't any more illuminator operators. We've been made into rear scanners. The illuminator that they were talking about was this huge contraption that was water cooled. It's electric, but it's water cooled because of the intensity of the heat that the light put out. And it used to go out kind of onto the ramp and shine down in case they needed to illumine a combat zone in a battle. That's what its purpose was. But it was replaced by modern technology. And this little bitty lamp, it looks small, but it's even more intense than this huge thing was. I would imagine if I took paper and put it in front of it when that thing was on, that paper wouldn't have lasted long, but that's just my opinion because I never did it to find out. I wasn't silly enough to do that. But I was now air crew, and I went through air crew training. It took a while. I was first sent to the altitude chamber and physiological training, it's called, where you learn what lack of oxygen deprivation can do to the human body because they subject you to it. And that is the weirdest thing that one goes through. You don't really, it creeps up on you. You don't really know it's happening. And before you know it, you can't function. You just don't move. Your brain doesn't function. And you're not thinking anything. And they had to put my mask up too with my own hand. They pulled it up to my face for me to get oxygen and brought me to. You don't pass out, you just are kind of frozen in place. And so you become conscious again. So that was that. Then they sent me down to an Air Force base that's near Miami for water survival. And that was interesting. I got to go up in parasailing because they train you for water entry, for where they're going to send you, because there's water in that area. And so I'm learning how to do water entry. Well, in order for you to get an idea of water entry, you're in a flight suit, you're in just as if you were out flying on a combat mission. And they put the screen up and they put this parachute up and you're on like a barge. And there's this huge, you have your group of guys with you in your training. There's this power boat. It's an inboard power boat that has two V8 engines in them, two 250 horsepower engines in them, and that's hooked to you. And they tell you, start walking, and the barge is moving, they're moving, and you're moving along, and they tell you, start moving and don't stop walking. Well, watch the guy in front of me, he stopped walking. And what happens is it's like flying a kite. You know how when you bring up a kite, you pull and then you let it go, and then you pull and you let it go, and it goes up, down, up and down. Well, he came down back on the deck, and that's what they were telling you not to stop walking for. So I knew better than to stop walking. So I was walking while we were still way out over the water, and they took me up 800 feet. That's how high they said they took me. I mean, I was almost directly overhead. That was the neatest feeling. This parasailing at 90 feet and nothing. And so I went up 800 feet, and then they cut you loose. And what they do is they give you a flag. They wave this flag, and you hit the open hand so it doesn't get, hands don't get in the way, and that detaches you, and you come down just like you would in a regular parachute, because that's what it is. And you do a water entry. And you know, they removed the cylinders that would blow up that raft. and they removed the ones that are on your life preserver. So you're sitting there, and the first thing you do is you blow up your life preserver so that you'll buoy there long enough to blow up your raft. I was lucky because I heard later there were a few of the guys that had holes in their rafts that they had to patch before they could blow them up. That must have been a trip. Like you would bicycle patch an inner tube on a bicycle in the old days. So that was kind of neat. Well, from there though, I've gone through physiological training. Now I've gone through water survival training, where they teach you not just about water entry, but how to survive on the open water in a raft, what's available to you, what kind of predators are in the sea, what you're subject to, and those kinds of things. It's interesting. But then they sent me to basic survival. Now, basic survival is something that I really can't go into because it's something that every air crew goes through, and it's something that you don't want to tell anyone about because it can have an effect on the crews long after you're dead and gone, even when you die of old age. Let me put it this way to you though. It's in the United States, but there's some that aren't. But this one's in the United States that I went to. It's important training. It's training that's meant to help you get home. My son later, years later, went into the Air Force after his dad did. He went into air crew. I asked him about this because I knew he went through it and I went through it. I figured by ourselves it'd be okay to talk about. And he started crying. It was that hard on him. It was hard. It was interesting. I remember that when it was over with and I saw the American flag, I started crying. I'd forgotten I was in the United States. Yeah. But from there, they sent me to jungle survival. So they sent me back to the Philippines. This time just long enough for me to take a course. It was a brief course, a classroom course for several days. And then they took us out into the jungle. And that was fun. They take you in by helicopter with Jolly Green. And I suppose that's one of the things that our rescue unit was doing that I didn't know about. That they were taking some of these air crews that were being trained in jungle survival before they took them over into Vietnam and other places over there. And took us, and we were dropped in on this hill, and it took off and left us. That is the weirdest feeling too, to be in a jungle. A jungle. Who knows how far away from civilization, and there ain't anybody around but you and the guys you're with. And we have one American survival instructor and one Negrito Hill tribesman. A Negrito Hill tribesman is a pygmy, plain and simple. They aren't more than 4 feet high, 4 foot something. And they are really cool people. And so he started teaching us, the two of them, how to survive in the jungle. Things not to deal with, things that would be a problem for us that we don't want to deal with. And to teach us how to hide, that was part of it. Our American sent his counterpart, the Negrito, out to hide. And then after just a few minutes, our instructor took us with him, walked into this area and said, "Now find him." And we're going, okay. And this isn't the regular hide and seek. The man was gone. And we were standing there and we couldn't see him. And the instructor said, "Look down." And the man was underneath us. There's this patchwork of vines and everything in the jungle floor. And he had opened it up with a stick, crawled inside and closed it. And I took pictures of it and couldn't see the guy in the picture. He was gone. Then came our turn. But the instructors aren't the ones who come after us. It's non-English speaking hill tribesmen, 2 of them. They're the two best hunters from their tribe. Because we're given two chits, they call them. They're like little dog tags, but they don't have any writing on them. And then there's a red one. The red one is in case of emergency. They get about 2 to 3 times as much rice if I give them a red one. That means I'm in trouble and they need to bring help to me. The other two simply means they caught me. And to let me know how they caught me, they have a little card, and it has pictures on it because they don't read and they don't write. And in the card are the 5 senses. And these guys had the capability of smelling you, seeing you, hearing you. And it was interesting. This one guy got caught, but I could hear him. These two guys, they would do is they go through the jungle and they would, in order to keep tabs on each other so that they didn't get too close and they didn't get too far away, would call out to each other this kind of call, this kind of yelp. One of our guys thought it would be fun to yelp back. And they honed in on him that way because they knew each other's voice. I don't know why it didn't occur to him, but that's how he got caught. Well, I was huddled under this bush, and I was huddled under there a long time. But I had made the mistake of drinking a little too much coffee, I think, and I had to go to the bathroom. And I was scrooched up in the fetal position, but I had to stretch out. So I stretched out, and I relieved myself, but it felt so good to extend my legs. I wasn't silly enough to stand up, but it felt so good to stretch my legs. And I guess I just was a little too lackadaisical about pulling myself back into that fetal position because I felt this little wiggle on my heel. And it wiggled a little bit longer and a little bit harder. And I ignored it as much as I could when he grabbed me by the ankles and started pulling me out. And as it turned out, the reason, of course, he had seen me, he'd seen my heel sticking out. But it turned out, I think, the reason that they hadn't thought to look where I was to begin with was I was under a fire plant. And the fire tree has a sap that will literally bring blisters to your skin. But I was in a full-blown flight suit, and I had flight gloves on, and so I was protected, except for the exposed areas around my neck where I got some irritation. But that's why I was caught only once. It only was a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes left. I figured it wasn't worth going and hiding again, so I just went back to camp from that. And from there, they sent me to my base in Ubon, Thailand. Thailand, on this map, is right about in here to the left of Cambodia, and Vietnam's over here. And I was sent to Ubon. This is where Ubon is. It's near the border of Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. And when I was in Ubon, I was assigned to the 16th Special Operations Squadron. It's the gunship squadron, as I said. I've been trained on A models and H models. The H model has a 105 howitzer on it, and I was once told that C-130 can't have a cannon in it. It would tear the tail off. Well, yes, there is a capability that they arrange for that does take the absorption of that recoil on that 105 howitzer, and it still moves and swings the tail off when it goes off. It feels like someone takes a needle and sticks and jabs your eardrum with it too when it goes off. My job was to hang out the back end of that thing tethered to a steel cable that was on the inside of the aircraft, and I would lean out as far as I could on one side as it was in an orbit to see whether the enemy was shooting at us, and if so, to tell the pilot how to get away. My switch cut out everybody's switch so that the pilot would hear my directions over everybody else's instructions to tell him how to get away from whatever it was that was being shot at us. Whether it was a surface-to-air missile, whether it was anti-aircraft artillery, whether it was that surface-to-air heat seeker, the Strela. That was my job. So we were with Wolfpack here. That was the fighter squadron that was there, and we were kind of with them. We used to refer to ourselves as 4-engine fighters. I think that proved to be a disadvantage later on. Whoever heard the rumor didn't know how to call us in, who weren't Air Force, and we couldn't strafe like they wanted us to. We could take up orbits, and they got so frustrated trying to get us in on one mission that they finally said, go do whatever it is that you do. That was after we did what we did with the embassies in Saigon and Phnom Penh. We were moved from Oban, where the gunships had been throughout pretty much all of their tour of duty in the Vietnam War, to Karat. Let's see, I looked at it earlier. I think it's right around in here. That's where we were moved. The people here weren't happy to see us. We took over their officers club because that was the only thing that would hold all 500 of us. Yes, we had 500 members to our squadron, air crew only, not even mentioning the ground crew. We had, 20 some odd gunships, some H models with howitzers, and some A models that only had 2 40mm cannons, and 2 Vulcan cannons. Vulcan cannon is electronic. It doesn't have a hammer like a regular gun does. It's shot off with a piece of electricity volt to it. It will put out 6,000 rounds in 1 minute. So these were cranked down because we couldn't carry that much ammunition. So they were cranked down to 2,500 rounds per minute. So when the pilot does short bursts, it would go zzz, zzz. That would be about 500 rounds in one burst. And we would fly missions, even in Ubon, we would fly down over in the Gulf of Thailand, what used to be the Gulf of Siam, and we had a water range, and that was so the pilots could actually use live ammunition and hone in on a target and keep their skills at hitting targets fine-tuned. I didn't know why. It never occurred to me why. As far as we knew, the Vietnam War was over. What's left for us to do? Why this? Why are we still here? We don't know. But you do what you're told. So, once a week, each crew member about once a week would get to go on a flight. We would love to fly, in an unpressurized aircraft. Now, at high altitude, it's cold. So you wear a winter flying suit. That's how cold it gets. But when you come down to level, it's 90 degrees. So colds are an issue, getting runny noses and everything else. I hated it because it would come out over you're hanging in a 300-mile-an-hour jet stream from that aircraft, and it's blowing out from your nose across your face shield. You're trying to see. Grease is coming off the bottom of the C-130. They're not the cleanest planes in the world, even after they've been washed. You don't wash them that often. They moved us to Karat, and we were still doing training missions. I remember one mission, problem with using the Gulf of Siam was that some of the Thai fishermen would try to retrieve the flares that we used. We were two kind that we used. We were using Navy flares. They were magnesium flares. Magnesium, once it's set off and it's on fire, it won't, you can't extinguish it with water. It will burn all the way through. And if you've seen any of the war movies recently where guys have been hit with shrapnel off of a magnesium hand grenade and it's firing, that thing will burn through his body till it comes out the other side. That's why they're trying to carve it out with a knife. And it will burn through an aircraft floor. It will burn through anything till it comes out the other side. You can't extinguish it. So there's these blocks, and they have about a 9-second fuse on them. And those are our targets. So the first thing I do is the pilot picks the area that he wants. The navigator chooses when he wants it dropped, and he lets me know, and I drop it. Okay? And the pilot takes an orbit around it. And then the navigator helps me drop 4 corners so that we've marked off for anyone in the area that's fishing or pleasure boating, which I don't think they had a lot of, in that area would know there's a firing range going on here. And then the pilot starts trying to shoot at that center target with the howitzer, with the 40mm cannon, with a Vulcan cannon. And there's so much sensor equipment on that aircraft, that pilot can do it pretty much every time, single time. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing how he does that. And my job from that point on is keeping those corners lit. But the problem is those fishermen try to retrieve them. I don't know why. I really don't know why. But they do. And the outer part of them, for the ones that are block style, are wood. They are cylindrical ones that are aluminum, kind of, and they burn. But they go after them. And then we've got to stop. We've got to move to a different area and set up all over again. So that cuts out time. It takes longer. So what I'm doing is, I see this boat coming, and he's coming up to one of my corners. And I've got, my job is to learn how to put down a flare so that if say for example, there's a battery of aircraft artillery shooting up at us, I should be able to put a flare on one side of it and on the other side of it, because we're slow movers. So we have F-4 Phantom jet fighter escorts. Their job is to engage the MiGs that might come try and shoot us down. But they also take out SAM sites, surface-to-air missile sites. So if I put down a flare on one side and a flare on the other and tell the the F-4 pilot escort to go and bomb in between those two, then they can take out that SAM site. I don't know how often that's ever done. I never did it. But in any case, I need to practice being able to do that. So when I see that it's been a while since a flare's been going, it's going to go out, and there's this column of smoke that marks it, and a column of smoke that marks for the target flare. And so I practice. So every now and then I'll wait, and I'm hanging out the aircraft, and I see the flare burning, the smoke come underneath the aircraft, and as it clears just under the fuselage, I throw out the other one. I pull the 9-second flare, and I'm waiting, and then throw it out. In midstream, it's already flaring. It went off. And I watch it go down as the smoke's coming out. And I've gotten pretty darn good about putting that flare next to that other one. I mean, really good. And so I've been doing this for a while. Well, I know that, but I had a burr up my rear end, and I wasn't going to let us be pushed off sight. So when that boat came up to that flare, I waited till we came around, and I watched, and I put out that other flare, and I watched it go down. And after I put it off, I went, if I miss my target, this is going to be a real issue. But it's too late. And no joke, I hit, and that splash comes out, and that little boat starts rocking, and off it peels. And we kept on sight for a while, practicing. But then one day, we were told that we were going to go on a mission, that something was coming up, and they needed our help. And it was what we were there for all along. And the first one dealt with Phnom Penh in Cambodia. There was a U.S. embassy in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. They made a movie about its fall called Killing Fields. And that was the day that we went. It was early in the morning, almost still dusk, or still nightfall when we took off. We came into the briefing area, and we knew it was the real deal because there were guards at the door, which meant you can go in, but you're not coming out. And then they took our crew, and they bussed us out to the flight line, and we got on our aircraft, and we took off. The squadron commander, we had a new squadron commander that came in from the Pentagon, because when we moved to Korat, we were sent a message, at least the rumor was, that we weren't going to take over that town like we took over Ubon. But people weren't used to us. When we went out for a night on the town, our groups of men could be 30, 50 guys in a group. Whereas other squadrons, you might have 2 or 3 guys. So when we went into a bar, we filled the bar. And one of my friends and some of his friends went into that bar, and it made the new owner, it wasn't really a new owner, but new to us, a bit nervous. And because we're a rowdy bunch, we work hard, we party hard. And I think a lot of the mystique and the reputation that we had not earned went to our head for being Spectre. And that's what our call sign was. We were Spectre, the ghost. We were the Spectre. And we consider ourselves the bad of the neighborhood. And yet, I don't think one of us would have taken on a Navy SEAL, let alone a Green Beret or even a PJ, because of what they go through. But we thought we were bad. And those guys they were in that bar and they were at a table, and that owner came up and he had gotten nervous because they were getting loud and kind of rowdy, and they'd been drinking for a while, and he told them to leave. And one of the guys stood up, and as he was coming between the tables, he bumped the table, so the story goes. And that bar owner started yelling at him and Ty, and my friend and some of the other guys, they popped a cork and they picked up the table and threw it through the window, and they destroyed that bar. They splintered it, and they didn't stop until they splintered it. And a number of them ended up in prison that night, and a number of them ended up being on base, back at base. They came and got our squadron commander and our, basically it'd be like the chief executive officer in charge. They got those two, and they deported them that night on a flight out of Thailand. We were left without a commander. We caused an international incident as a group. Eventually the other guys get back from prison. They're brought back in. I don't think they were there much longer, at least we call it prison. It's kind of their form of jail. I mean, they don't have the kind of correctional facilities that we have here in the United States. But it was the civilians who had him at first and then turned him over to the U.S. government at the base. And it's the Royal Tyler Air Force Base. Like I said, they aren't our bases. We lease them, or through treaty or whatever. And that's when that Pentagon colonel was sent in. And he was sent from the Pentagon. He didn't come immediately. He waited a while. And eventually he showed up, and he pulled all of us in. I think he did it in shifts, because even the base theater wasn't big enough for us to hold all of us at once. And he brought us in, and he stood on that stage and he told us that we weren't jack garbage. We weren't jack garbage. And he's right. We hadn't fought like the guys before us. I remember before I left Eglin Air Force Base to come here, one of the true heroes, a gunship air crew member who came back into being a crew chief, came into my outfit, and I got a chance to talk to him. He was a Silver Star winner, and the way he won the Silver Star, which is pretty darn high, he was hanging out the back of the airplane. This is all at night. They're meant to be flown at night. When they had a surface-to-air missile shot at them, they were convoy busting. They would bust the lead truck on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bust the last truck so it was locked in, and then it'd go down the line, destroying all the trucks. Well, they started carrying mobile surface-to-air missiles on those things. They shot one at him. Well, they were able to get away from that one. And when a surface-to-air missile comes at you, it looks like a donut, because you got the afterburner that's white hot. But the cold spot is the missile itself, so when it's coming at you, it looks like a donut coming up at you that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it takes a few minutes, because its fins are mechanically operated, not like the surface-to-air heat seeker, which is a small thing that kind of comes up at you like this. So it's coming like this, and its little afterburner looks multicolored, sort of purple and violet and stuff. But this other thing is coming in a smooth scale, and it's locked into that. It can't make sudden moves. So you wait till it gets near, and then you drop, or you turn real quick, and it bypasses you. Plus you're throwing out chaff, which is little flakes of metal that are meant to disrupt the radar signature so that the missile doesn't know what it's going after, and it's kind of pulled off to one side. Whereas with the heat seeker, you shoot a very pistol flare at it as you turn into it, so that your engines are turned away from its heat seeking. Yeah, it sounds stupid to go into a missile that's coming at you instead of away from you, but that's exactly what you do to get away from it. And as you turn in it, you're shooting off a very pistol flare that is a bright spot for it to lock onto, so that it will go after that. With this though, you're going away from it, and as it gets closer, you're throwing out the chaff, and then at the last minute you make a sudden turn to get away from it. You don't go up, you go either down or you just simply drop. And so they talked about it, the crew talked about it, and that was a real juicy kill that they were after. And so they decided to go back. And they went back after it, according to my friend, and this time they shot 2 surface-to-air missiles at him at the same time, and that's where he got his Silver Star. Because he told the pilot as they pulled away from it as fast as he could, when he tells him he's to drop as fast as he can, he'll say to drop. And so it's getting brighter and brighter. He waited till it got so close that both those donuts became one. That's how close they were to him. When he was so scared, he said, that all he could do was scream, "Down, down, down!" And the pilot pulled back on the controls for the power, and a C-130, 180,000 pounds, will drop like a rocket. It did. But as the missiles went over the tail, they exploded with a proximity fuse, and he took the shrapnel. Well, it just so happens that that aircraft was at that base that I was telling you about when I didn't exist. They brought it in, and it was parked on the base. It was heading back to the United States, and someone had told me, "You've got to see this." And so I went with them, and they took me inside that aircraft. The guns had been removed, and I went inside. So I really didn't know it was a gunship, but that's what it was. And he took me into the tail of the aircraft, and he closed up the aircraft. And people, it looked like the inside of a planetarium. There were so many holes in it. And this friend of mine that I met in Eglin later was so full of shrapnel they couldn't get it out of him. He was salt and peppered. And when I looked at the frame on the inside of the aircraft, that magnesium frame looked like it had been butter and a hot knife had gone through them. That's how much, and that went into his body. He said he had, when he took off his 16-pound ballistic helmet, because we wore a ballistic helmet, there was a piece of shrapnel lodged in the side of it that the helmet saved his life. He now had to carry a letter with him whenever he flew to let the airports know that he was full of metal, and that's what was setting off their metal detectors. So that was what we were up against. Well, on this day that we went for Phnom Penh, that same squadron commander from the Pentagon pulled off the pilot and took his place. He was as gung-ho as we were. And he flew in, and we were the first gunship on site. And we took up an orbit over the soccer field that they were using to helicopter out. And the Marine helicopters were coming underneath, Hueys and such. I think they were Jolly Greens. I really wasn't paying attention to the helicopters as much as the outer area, because that's where the enemy were. We knew that they were outside, just outside the city. We didn't know what they were going to do. The Cambodian army, the communist Cambodian army were considered crazy. They were lethal, unpredictable. And so we're there, but it's an H model. H model has a bubble in the door, in the cargo door. And I'm supposed to sit in the bubble, look out the bubble for everything. And there's grease coming across it that's flying off the aircraft, and I'm ticked. It's a bad day. I remember when we were still on the ground and they came up to me, because normally we just wear the vest and the holster's empty, and they walked up to me and handed me a .38 revolver and a sandwich bag with 6 ball ammunition bullets, not even hollow point. And I looked at that gun, and I went, someone's going to want to kill me today. And I put that gun in, and I put the bullets away, because there's no point in putting them in there. You're not going to stop it. What are you going to do with an AK-47 looking at you? You're going to put your hands up. So anyway, we took orbit, and I told the pilot that I couldn't see, and I was just frustrated. So he slowed down long enough for me to open up the door, and I took my position hanging out the aircraft like I normally do. And then he went ahead and took up his orbit. And I looked underneath initially, and there was an OV-10 flying underneath us. And it was like, if we shoot, it's going to go through his wing before it makes its target. So I called the pilot up and told him, you need to tell that we've got this OV-10 underneath us that's flying in orbit. We need to get him out of there. So he did the pilot contacted the control that was, the air control that was operating this whole thing. They told him to leave and he left. And then I hung out there. Well, before we left, this gunner came up to me. And he was already harassing me. He wanted to pull ramp time. He wanted to hang out the back. He wanted to have that stuff blowing up his nose and everything else. He wanted to hang out the back. And I don't know why I did. I was irritated. I was frustrated. I hadn't done what I was trained to do. I wasn't a hero. I watched below me. They look like ants. It's 1975, April. I may be 24, or fixing to turn 24. That's no excuse. They're just ants to me. You know, you can't, really, a decent human being can't kill another decent human being for no reason. That's why you use words like gook and other things. You have to dehumanize your target because it's a human being. I remember watching one BDA tape, that's a battle damage tape, where the pilot took it personal that this truck driver is trying to save his life. He's running away. He jumped. You can see it on the BDA tape with the sensors. There's this little white dot jumping out of the truck, and he's running with a 105 howitzer. He's trying to hit this little target that's moving, and then it jumps into this crater that had already been made by the pilot, and he switches guns. He switches to the Gatling gun. Now the Gatling gun has shells in the casing, but this part, which goes up into this part, is fragmentary, like a fragmentary grenade. It doesn't just hit. This isn't like World War II where you have ball ammunition coming at you. These things explode. It's putting out 2,500 rounds per minute of fragmentary grenades is what it amounts to. And he switched that gun and he put a burst into that hole. And it looks like someone said, "Beam me up, Scotty." And you're thinking about that, and you know there's a human being in the middle of that, and you know that all they're going to be able to do is find goo. They're not going to find a human being in there. And we just did that to that person. That's what they did. And I say we because I'm part of that force. If someone did it, I did it. And you know that. But if you don't dehumanize them, that if that pilot hadn't dehumanized that person into a thing, into a target, he would have never been able to pull that trigger. I believe that with all my heart. No human being can do what we do with it. You just can't bring yourself to do it. And so I'm looking out, and I'm still of that frame of mind at those ants scurrying about. I mean, it's not occurring to me what will occur to me later when the movie Killing Fields comes out and I take up the guts to go see it. And I see what goes on the ground, what I saw going on from the air. And I realized that people were in terror and they were running for their lives. That the massive force was coming in and it was going to butcher them, and they knew it. They were fearful for their children. They were fearful for their wives. They were fearful for their husbands, and I saw them as ants scurrying about. And I was bored. I was freaking bored. Pissed off, disappointed, and bored. I was a moron, an idiot, unsensitive. And I let that gunner take on to the ramp, and I watched those other gunners look at me, and I didn't care anymore. And after a few minutes, I pulled him off the ramp, and I got back into my position. And then we were switched jobs with another gunship that took our place, and they took over, and we went back home. When we landed, you'd have thought we were landing at a carnival. There were fire trucks there and water and hoorays and everything. And I'm going, what the heck for? What did we do? We didn't do garbage. We didn't do nothing. We didn't shoot at anybody. Nobody shot at us. What did we do? But I wasn't thinking about those ants. We at least kept some people off their backs long enough for some of them to get out, but that didn't cross my mind. I was bored. I was disillusioned. So I went out one exit while everybody else went out the other to enjoy their hurrahs. I didn't even go to the debriefing. I forgot to go to the debriefing. The only way they knew I was there was that my name was on the manifest. They keep a roster of every crew and where they go and who's on the crew. Now I went back to the barracks. I knew I was done with gunships. I knew I'd never fly once I got home. I didn't belong. When I was in rescue, I belonged. What I did with rescue, to me, meant something. The word rescue meant something. Heck, the motto of the PJs, the parajumpers, is that others may live. Now, what better motto can you have than that? And I made the mistake of leaving that for this. But in a way, weren't we rescue of sorts on this situation? But I didn't see, I was blind. And soon after, we get orders to pull out. First, Phnom Penh Falls, we get the embassy out of there. Then Saigon Falls. Some of our aircraft were involved in that, I wasn't. And then there was one other incident. It was in Cambodia. It's called the Mayaguez incident. It was a Navy Air Force operation. Navy intelligence. Well, any kind of branch of intelligence is a contradiction in terms. Because everything they said it was going to be, it wasn't. They told us in debriefing that there was going to be a 50 caliber machine gun and a small garrison of men. Turned out to be an anti-aircraft gun and a garrison, I don't know in Army terms what they call it, but it was huge. And when the Marines landed at one end, my friends who went into that battle, and it was a fighting battle. It was a getting shot at, shooting back battle. Men died that day. And there were only nine crew members on the boat that we were trying to get back, the USS Mayaguez. And it wasn't where, and they weren't where the Navy thought they were. Because while all of this is going on, gunboats are coming out trying to reinforce, Cambodian gunboats are coming out to this little island where the ship was moored, trying to reinforce the people there while the Navy is plummeting, pounding it, and the Marines are pounding it, running down the beaches, and it's just pure chaos. The first two United States Air Force helicopters get shot down. They're full of special forces, Air Force special forces. They get shot down. That's more than the crew that we're trying to rescue. The third one that got shot down did what we call a John Wayne. Since he's going down and he saw the other two helicopters, and when a helicopter crashes, pretty much you're not going to have many survivors, if any. So he went down into the battery and took it out. That's how they got rid of that anti-aircraft battery, was that the third helicopter crashed into it. That was what I was told by the guys who were coming back as planes were going and crews were coming back, and the excitement in the outfit was bananas. Because we had finally gotten into a fighting war. And so the Navy they were the ones who were telling us to strafe. And we don't strafe. So they said, go do whatever it is that you do. Well, it's interesting because we had so much experience, the pilots of our squadron had so much experience on that water range that they were able to take out those gunboats. So they took up orbit over the gunboats that were trying to get to the island. And sometimes the gunboat would just hit it just before that 105 howitzer shell went in there and blew it up. So that's what we were doing as a gunship. That was our participation in that little war that took place in that little bay. And B-52s, in the meantime, are just carpet bombing the town, the port on the other side of the bay where this ship is moored. And so Cambodia said, well, we've had enough. Of course, that was before the Air Force said, and this is what one of the guys told me, so I didn't get to watch it, but I don't I have no doubts. From what I gather, somebody said, you know what we need here is a helicopter landing pad. Well, the Air Force has a bomb called the Daisy Cutter that they use to make instantaneous helicopter pads. It will make a crater a mile wide. It is 25,000 pounds in the new one. The old one then was 15,000 pounds of explosive, a 15,000 pound bomb called the Daisy Cutter. They have a new one that they used with the Gulf War that was bigger than that. That I think I hear was 25,000 pounds, but I don't know for sure. But the 15,000 pound Daisy Cutter bomb went off. They told the Marines to dig in, and it made an instantaneous. I've seen films of it. They showed films of it to us when we were in tech school. Because the C-130 is the only thing that can drop it. It fills up the cargo bay. It's about the size of a Volkswagen bus. And it goes out the back by parachute. And it comes down, it hits the ground, and it explodes just before it hits the ground. And the trees from the films that I watched literally look like they jump out of the ground and then lay back in a circle, just laying back, folding back, just like when Mount St. Helens went off and blew all that forest down. It's about what it looks like. So that's what they dropped on the island. After that, pretty much from what I gather, all the fighting had been knocked out of the enemy. And so they called in, said, we're done, you can have the boat, you can have the men. And they did. Turns out the men were in that harbor that they were carpet bombing. Yeah, they'd taken them from the island and moved them to a safer place, they thought. So there was no safe place. And that was the last military engagement that we were involved in Southeast Asia, as far as gunships go, in 1975. About the same time that these others went on, Phnom Penh, Saigon, and not too much, maybe a week or so later, that incident with the Mayaguez. Part of it was because the Cambodians had seized it in what the U.S. said was international waters. And so they were defining what their territory was. I was selected to help bring a gunship back, and we island hopped all the way back to the United States. We broke down just about every place that we landed. We landed in, first we landed in the Philippines, then from there we went to Guam, from there we went to Kwajalein, Midway, Alaska, and then down into Washington State, and then they cut me loose to go to my next duty station, which was at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C. I was assigned to the same squadron that supports Air Force One. As a turboprop maintenance crew chief, I was assigned to the aircraft that Lyndon Baines Johnson, former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, had been given after he left the presidency. Each president, when they leave the White House, still has certain privileges that the United States government affords them. When it comes to transportation, the Air Force is there. And so it was a little twin-engine, it wasn't a C-130, it's a whole different type of aircraft, but it's a beautiful plane. And so it had been returned after his death, and so now it was in Andrews Air Force Base, along with some other smaller planes that were used by congressmen and women to go different places, some overseas, some around the United States on their missions. There were planes that the vice president used, and this was before they had the 747 for the president. It was the old aircraft, the same one I believe that was used for President Kennedy. Air Force One is a designation. I'm sure by now y'all seen enough movies that let you know that that's what that is. If he gets into a Piper Cub, it becomes Air Force One. But now it's a 747 is used. At that time, I had just started seeing what were called mobile command posts at Andrews Air Force Base. They were off by themselves. They had a couple of them. We didn't know what they did. They were not marked like the aircraft that the president's marked in, and they had their own thing. When the president was coming, when Marine One was coming, the helicopter that he uses to get from the White House, because they don't take a motorcade. In any movie you see that they do, you can forget it. They take him from his lawn and take him directly from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base, and he picks up his flight there. It's interesting when the Secret Service show up. There are 2 metal detectors, and they actually inspect their own luggage, each other's luggage, and other people's luggage who are coming on board before they load up the aircraft and before the president shows up. And when he shows up, everything shuts down. Nobody moves. Nobody moves on that flight line except those that are directly involved in him taking off. So originally I was with them down the ramp in that unit, but I wanted to go to college, and I never had an opportunity to go. And when I was growing up, I've pretty much been told I was dumber than dirt, and more than once. And I couldn't prove them just otherwise. I mean, my grades were D's and F's. The only thing I made A's in was physical education and art. I loved art. So I decided, I'm going to find out for sure. So I wanted to be able to take college courses, and so I asked to move down the flight line a bit to the organizational maintenance unit, the 89th Organizational Maintenance Unit, which is crash recovery for any delegation and support for any delegation that comes in from another country. Because some of the countries down south of our border use C-130s to transport their dignitaries, at least were at that time. So I would get to work on theirs. I remember one time, I was the only C-130 maintenance person in that outfit, in the 89th OMS. We had different types for different types of aircraft. And had a C-130 come in from down south. And C-130s use a window panes. They look more like panes. When you get a bird strike on an aircraft, I've seen the films of it as I was studying about NISA windshields. If a bird hits it and that windshield isn't heated, it will go through that windshield and take out that portion of the cockpit. It's like getting hit by a cannonball. They've done wind tunnel experiments, and you see that, so that they show the mechanics what it actually does, so it will be more conscientious and be more attentive to what's going on in that windshield. Because it's heated when it flies, and that kind of firms it up, and they showed that once it's heated, that thing is pretty much bulletproof from a standard bullet. Maybe not from an aircraft bullet, but from a rifle or something like that, it won't go through. So that bird will literally bounce off if it's heated. But if it has a bubble in it, beyond a certain size, it weakens that, and that becomes a point of impact that will literally shatter it. So you don't want it to have larger than a certain size bubble. We don't like any bubbles in them at all, but they get them from constant heat, reheat. Well, this dignitary C-130 came in, and it had a pretty good sized bubble in it. And being the aircraft mechanic that I am, I brought it to people's attention. I said, we need to change this windshield. Well, there's only one way to change a C-130 windshield at that time. Now, I know I've read things on Google and everything else and how they do it now. I don't know if the Air Force has changed, but we used to use tank sealant. Yeah, the same things that we sealed aircraft tanks into the wing of an aircraft was what we used to seal that NISA panel into place, because there's several of them. And but one way, that sucker ain't gonna come off with nail polish remover. There's over 100 screws holding that thing in addition to that tank sealant. So the first thing is, and they have little hold in place nuts. So you take out all the screws. Once you've taken those out, the thing comes in. So you're going to pound it in. We have chocks. They're kind of like wooden blocks. Huge things that go front of and behind the wheels to keep this plane from rolling in high winds and whatever. Well, you take one of those chocks, and first thing you take masking tape and you mask that paint all over, just like you would in a hurricane, and to keep from pieces of broken glass. And this pane is about an inch thick. This Nissan windshield is about an inch thick. And you start pounding on it with that chalk as hard as you can. And you pound on it, and you pound on it, and you pound on it for hours before you get a crack. Once it cracks, then it starts to crumble. But that first crack, you have to take shifts. It takes two guys changing shifts, pounding on that thing as hard as it can to put that crack in it. And it takes hours to do it. So that you spend most of your shift just beating on that sucker, and then the next shift comes in and picks up where you left off. And they're likely going to be the ones that put in the new one, because you don't take this sucker off before you have the replacement in hand. So anyway, when that chief stepped out of the office into the hangar and saw me take that chalk and hit that windshield, he went berserk and came running to me. "What are you doing, Sarge? Sarge, what are you doing?" I'm a staff sergeant by this time. I said, "Sarge, this is the only way you're going to get that thing out." So I opened up to where I was. I learned my lesson. So I was there, I was, and I showed him word for word. Beat the thing with a chalk till it crumbles. And that's exactly, and if I hadn't said that, I'd been in plenty of trouble. But even the United States Air Force knew that was what you needed to do. He said, "Okay," and he walked off. He thought it was the craziest thing, because you don't need to do that for fighter aircraft or any others. Just for this beautiful C-130. She'll take a beating and keep on ticking. So anyway, finally got that windshield out, got the new one in, and sent that on the way. But that was kind of a learning experience for that crew. I was a hands-on sergeant. The only scolding I ever got from another sergeant was in this outfit of OMS. I've been given a 5-level younger guy to train. That's what staffs do. They train the people under them. But I was hands-on, and I didn't have a lot of confidence. No offense to the young man, I really didn't know him that well. But when that master sergeant walked up behind me, and I was the one who was changing out the part, and the airman was watching me do it, he said, "Wait a minute. Y'all need to reverse roles here, Sarge." He says, "This kid ain't gonna learn anything if you keep doing it that way." So I had to talk him through it. That was hard for me to do. I liked hands-on. It was at that point that I knew I was never gonna be able to make it as a master sergeant. I'm just not a manager. I liked having my hands on the aircraft. I liked flying with the aircraft. I liked being involved. The only thing was, I liked college more. And when I got to go into college, I had to get out. I wanted to go to college full time so bad, and finally I did. They wanted to transfer me to Langley in Virginia. And I'm sure people have heard a lot about Langley, but it is an Air Force base, and there is a Army base nearby, and we do work with the Army and their paratroopers. They're airborne down there. Army doesn't have airplanes. They have helicopters. They don't have airplanes. We're their horse when it comes to that. So if you see them jumping out of an airplane, you can just about bet it's either going to be the Marines or the Air Force that they're jumping out of, and hopefully it's the Air Force. No offense to the Marines. But anyway, I only had 9 months left in the Air Force when they came to this point. They were already having troop reduction. Remember, they had built up over, millions in the military, all the branches, for Vietnam War, and now they didn't need them, didn't have a war. So they were rifting officers. That means they were giving them the opportunity to become enlisted in order to stay in, because in the military, when you retire, if you stay and you retire, you will get the retirement pay for the highest rank that you held. So even an officer, if he becomes enlisted, when he retires, will retire at his highest officer rank. So some officers chose to do that. They would become things like master sergeants and such. And some chose to go to the reserves, which is an inactive version of the Air Force regular. They're not like the Guard, the Air National Guard and the Guard. Those are militias for the states. The reserves are still a federal military. And so they started cutting back. But they wanted to keep me in. They'd invested a lot of money in me as far as training, when you really think about it. And I put in a lot of hours. Officially, I was considered a combat aircrew member because of what went on with Phnom Penh and that whole issue, even though I did what I did. So there was a lot of stuff invested in me, and they wanted to hold on to me, but I wouldn't re-enlist. And in the military, unless you have at least 12 months left on your tour, on your enlistment, you cannot be transferred, because it's not worth them to transfer you to another outfit just for you to turn around and walk out the gate. So they were pressuring me to re-enlist, so much so that they were saying that I couldn't come back if I ever changed my mind. But I wasn't going to change my mind. I knew it. I wanted that college degree badly. And I knew too then that the only, it doesn't take much to figure it out. Military can tell you at that time. We knew there was such a bad taste in people's mouth for Vietnam. It was going to take hell and high water to get us into another engagement. And you know, there ain't but one hell and high water that would move the American people: oil. And we knew it. The next fight was going to be over oil. It was the only thing that would get the people to go back to war over it. The veterans could have told you. And I remember being in Okinawa. I went in TDY in Okinawa. I said something polite about the Philippines. Well, in World War II, the Filipinos were part of a freedom movement, freedom fighter movement. They would go into the camps. They were so good at stealth, and they still were when I was there. As far as thievery, it was hard to catch them. We had one guy, I was there in the barracks when his check got stolen off his chest. He thought that it was safe. They put it on his chest and it wouldn't be stolen. They stole it right off his bare chest. And then the police came in, lined up. I watched the police, I listened to them. They told the houseboys, we don't care who did it. All we want is the check back. We're going to leave. We're going to come back in 30 minutes for our lunch break. When we come back, if that check is on his dresser, that's the end of it. And there it was. And so that's how stealthy they are. Well, during World War II, they would go down into the Japanese barracks at night, and they would cut off the ear of every other man sleeping. Think about that. Not the gruesome part of it, because in order for you to cut off the ear, you first have to cut his throat. So he's dead, but they're doing every other one in the barracks. So all these other guys who aren't killed, this is being done right under their noses, and these guys aren't being caught. And that was the legend of the Filipino. And I respected them, even though they took a contract out on me. That was their culture, and they've done good things. And I had friends that were Filipino that were really good guys. I mean, even my martial arts instructor was a really nice guy. I liked him. But it was the Japanese that they were doing it to. So going into Okinawa and saying something nice about the Filipinos, and the Filipinos at that time where I was, they were talking about the atrocities that the Japanese soldiers did to their children, using them for bayonet practice and all sorts of stuff. And I don't know if that's true. I just know that this is how these people felt about one another. They had heated emotions about one another. And this moron sits in an Okinawan bar and says something nice to an Okinawan about a Filipino. The screaming and hollering about baby killer and everything else started coming out of their mouth, along with flying bottles. And yeah, I was ready to get out. I knew that there wasn't going to be a war for a while, and I saw no point in staying in. Sure enough, when they started having the issues with OPEC, I knew we would go to it, and balls kept rolling. The only thing I think from a veteran's point of view is how veterans have been, how we're treated is different now than what happened then. I think there's a bit of guilty conscience for those screaming and hollering in our face over something we had nothing to do. No joke, when I was at Clark, Jane Fonda showed up at our gate, at our front gate, 1972. I was there from 71 to 72. 1972, a guy comes to me and says, Jane Fonda's at the gate. I'm going, cool. I'd seen her in Barbarella. I think most of the guys had seen her in Barbarella. The only thing we wanted to see was see her in Barbarella. She wasn't here to show us Barbarella. So her and some of her friends were at the gate, and what I heard was, from the guys, was that she was talking something about laying down your arms, this is an unjust war, and nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wants to be told that what they have no control over. I mean, are you kidding? You're asking your military to make a choice? The choice comes from Washington, not us. And people seem to have it asked